The Life of All for One, My Hero Academia. All for One, surname Shigaraki, is the big bad of the My Hero Academia manga and anime series. The founder and benefactor of the League of Villains, he was once Japan's most powerful villain and All Might's arch-nemesis. His ultimate goal was to steal One for All, a quirk that originally belonged to his younger twin brother, and the only quirk that can oppose him. He became the mentor of Tomura Shigaraki, having spent the young villain's life shaping him into a successor and a vessel for his power in a plan to eventually conquer the world as a self-proclaimed demon lord. Eventually, he became obsessed with destroying the ninth wielder of One for All, Izuku Midoriya, to complete his century-long plan. Welcome to the Amagi. Before we begin, only 25% of our viewers are subscribed, so if you're a fan of the video, please like and double check if you're subscribed. And with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Early life. The Shigaraki brothers were born to a sex worker who wasn't even aware of her pregnancy for the first 8 months, in an era before meta abilities were known, with the mother unknowingly possessing one which caused hardened growths to appear on her arm. She died in childbirth by a riverbank as a result of the twins sapping away her life force, with the older brother in particular consuming most of the nutrients, leaving very little for his younger brother. Upon the twins' birth, the older brother, who also happened to possess a meta ability to steal other meta abilities, immediately stole the mother's meta ability, Spear-like Bones, for himself, while devouring the body and holding his younger brother's arm. Just as rats came to gnaw on the newborns and their mother's corpse, they were washed away by the flood. 1 year later, the luminescent baby was born, and meta abilities became more wide known and recognized, with a research group hypothesizing that a novel disease was to blame, announcing that those with meta abilities were sub-branches of humanity with new genetic factors. This announcement caused many people to be divided, and chaos started to grow, with people without meta abilities waging war and terror against the ones with powers, and the latter doing the same. The older Shigaraki brother grew up alongside his younger brother within this hellish world on their own. The older brother named his younger brother Yoichi, using the kanji for bestow and one because he was his first possession. He approached a group of anti-meta masked soldiers who, despite their sympathy for the boy, recognized him as an exceptional child, saying they should leave him be since kids are most likely to be carriers. He then sprouted an array of spear-like bones from his body, killing them all instantly. Due to his imbued hubris and disrespect for others from the moment of his birth, the older brother viewed all within his reach as his own possessions, and those who wouldn't turn to look at him when he cried, or those who couldn't provide him with anything, he responded with utter distrust. The boy proceeded to rampage throughout the streets, killing everyone who refused him and stealing their meta abilities. During one of his rampages, Yoichi threw a can at him, telling him to stop hurting people, but his brother kicked him down in response. While Yoichi provided him with nothing, the older brother still considered him one of his possessions he would not easily release, so he kept him close. Throughout his childhood, the older brother would do as he pleased, killing and stealing meta abilities, and every time Yoichi would try to stop him, he would respond with physical abuse or retaliation for interfering. One day, as Yoichi was self-teaching himself to read, the older brother approached him, demanding to know what it was he was reading. Yoichi said he's still learning, so he's reading Captain Hero comic books, which he considers amazing, since they tell you the hopes and dreams in people through the drawings. He says one day he would like to be like the hero in the book. The older brother took an interest in the comic too and started reading with him. 3 years later, as the world descended into further chaos due to the meta abilities, the older brother felt discontent with the luminescent baby's increasing popularity, gaining millions of followers as they preached peace for society, calling it weird why they should be the one to become so popular just because they were the first recorded, especially with 50 babies being born with meta abilities in India 2 weeks ago. The older brother decided that the child and their followers did not deserve the right to mobilize so many, so he killed them and stole their meta ability. He revealed this whole thing to Yoichi, who reacted in shock and horror. Yoichi asked why he did it, and the older brother responded that he did it just like what the comics said, one for all and all for one, sharing his dream to Yoichi. While Yoichi was a fan of the titular protagonist, Captain Hero, the older brother became a fan of Captain Hero's nemesis, the Demon Lord King. While the hero fought in solitude with a secret identity, the Demon Lord was paid tribute and ruled out of fear. Just like Yoichi's dream of being a hero, he now wants a world solely for his own sake, having found his dream. The older brother, now going by his quirk name, All for One, rose to new heights in Japan. He decided to exploit the chaos, stole many quirks, and attained immense power and influence. Using his incredible might, the man unified thousands of people under his command. He then manipulated the people he gathered like pawns to further his plans and eventually become the ruler of Japan. It's suggested that he ruled from the shadows, as most of his actions in the present day are only known as rumors on the internet. He also started grooming other powerful individuals who he deemed to have a lot of potential, such as Gigantomachia, who became his personal bodyguard, though when this happened is unknown. All for One was accused of atrocity for his actions by Yoichi. All for One claimed that he was only helping people by taking away undesirable quirks and giving power to the weak, thus contributing to the restoration of humanity in a chaotic era. He then gave a demonstration on how he used his quirk to help others and presented two people. A young man with a quirk that gave him a mutant jaw. He caringly looked after his grandparents but was shunned by society because of his appearance, and even his parents wouldn't speak with him. And an ordinary man who was attacked by a group of quirk users, with the stun gun he relied upon being rendered useless. All for One then used his power to take away the young man's quirk, subsequently removing his mutant jaw and giving the other man a quirk proficient for self-defense. After doing so, All for One asks the two if he can call on them in times of need, and both men swear their allegiance to him in gratitude. Yoichi, however, pointed out that All for One was only conducting subtle schemes as to gather followers, and would dispose of them after they had become worthless to him. Yoichi refused to give in and tried to rebel but was stopped by All for One's personal bodyguard. All for One berated his brother for not having a quirk but said that he still loved him as he is his only family and imprisoned him rather than killing him. When All for One visited his captive brother, he saw how emaciated he had become. He tells Yoichi about how a group who refused to join him were killed simply because his followers interpreted his desires as instructions to kill them. All for One admits that it's like a dream come true, just like in the comics when they were kids. Yoichi was disgusted and voiced his defiance against his brother, telling him he had only read up to volume 3 of the series and that there was more to the story, saying that the powerful villains always lose to the heroes of justice. Insulted, All for One reproaches him that real life does not work like the comics, and that he will rewrite reality. Eventually, in a twisted showcase of affection, All for One decided to forcefully implant a power stockpiling quirk that even his frail body could handle, with the intent of turning him on his side. All for One grabs his brother's forehead and transfers the quirk to stockpile power to him despite his pleas to stop. What no one knew at the time was that Yoichi already had an innate quirk, and the two quirks merged to form a new one, One for All. Battle against One for All users. When All for One was reaching the peak of his powers, he was being opposed by a resistance led by a spiky-haired man named Kudo, the future second user of One for All. And while he had no direct confrontation with this resistance, he allowed his growing numbers of subordinates to deal with them and the rest later. One day, Kudo and his companion Bruce, the future third user, rescued Yoichi from his imprisonment after deciding against their initial assassination attempt. 2 months later, after Yoichi was freed, All for One tracked his brother to the Resistance's base of operations to reclaim him. He confronts them in the sewers as they attempted to flee, annoyed at why his brother was trying to escape him, and even more so at the man who had stolen his property. Fed up with his brother refusing to listen, All for One uses a spatial distortion meta ability on Yoichi to kill him, leaving nothing behind but his left hand. An emotional Kudo, covered in Yoichi's blood, stared into All for One's thin, clouded eyes, which didn't reflect anything and showed no sense of feeling before escaping. All for One recovers Yoichi's hand and examines it in his tower, realizing that the meta ability he forcibly gave to him was gone, which had never happened before. He thought his brother didn't have a meta ability and he unconsciously stole it when they were babies, but through examination found out that he actually did have a factor, but it was so insignificant and non-functioning that his own power didn't even recognize it as a meta ability. He thinks the factor never quite took form, possibly due to malnourishment, and wonders if it somehow activated itself. All for One comes to the conclusion that the meta ability he granted Yoichi was essentially absorbed by his own to make up for what it lacked, and also meant that he still lived on within the meta ability. He tracks down Kudo to reclaim his brother's meta ability and to exact revenge for making him kill his brother, massacring the entire resistance, leaving only Kudo standing to oppose him. Kudo wasn't strong enough to defeat All for One. However, by this point, he had already passed down Yoichi's meta ability, now known as One for All, to Bruce. With Kudo defeated, All for One held him by the throat, demanding to know the whereabouts of his younger brother. Kudo replied that Yoichi is dead and that he was the one who killed him. For the first time, All for One felt incredibly anguished upon hearing this, though he claimed his crocodile tears were just to cause confusion, as everything he loathed and coveted he manipulated and corrupted to make his own. He began to choke the life out of Kudo, easily stopping a bullet shot at him from behind by Kudo's meta ability Gear Shift. All for One eventually kills Kudo, all the while in his final moments he simply smiles at the villain in satisfaction. Throughout the century, All for One became obsessed with acquiring One for All, and sought out every successor who obtained it in an attempt to reclaim his brother. In an extra level of petty revenge against Kudo, he exterminated his family bloodline, including every woman and child he was close to. He found and killed Bruce, but discovered he no longer had One for All within him, and was unable to track down the fourth user, Hikage Shinomori. It was during this time that he continued to consolidate his power against the masses that he met Kyudai Garaki. Kyudai theorized the Quirk singularity, according to which someday Quirks will become so powerful that they will be uncontrollable, but society scoffed at this theory, so he disappeared from the public eye. However, possibly due to the nature of his own quirk, All for One believed this theory and lent Kyudai his aid. Since then, Kyudai has been working for All for One. As a gift of loyalty and appreciation, Kyudai duplicated his life force quirk and gave his original quirk to All for One, keeping the duplicate. Thanks to this, both he and All for One continue to live to this day. Eventually, All for One tracked down the fifth user, Daigoro Banjo, and attempted to steal One for All from within him and surprisingly failed. Daigoro was able to pass the quirk onto the sixth user, and Tayutai before he was killed. All for One tried again to steal the quirk from N, but once again failed, and it turned out this was due to its inherent willpower and refusal to submit to All for One. N was sliced in half, but managed to survive long enough to pass the quirk along to the seventh user, Nana Shimura, who then managed to escape. Sometime later, Nana, alongside her pupil, the eighth bearer Toshinori Yagi, and her friend Sorahiko Torino, tried to fight him. However, despite their best efforts, All for One still overwhelmed them. Aware that they could not defeat him, Nana pushed Toshinori out of harm's way, and Gran Torino fled with Toshinori as the young man cried for his master. Nana departed some final words of encouragement onto Toshinori before standing against All for One last time. The villain mocked her for providing comedy before killing her by unleashing a large flash of black lightning. However, before that, Nana managed to get the last words as he was choking her out, as she told him Toshinori would be the one to finally defeat him, since he's even crazier than himself. Soon afterwards, All for One came to realize that as a result of his encounters with Daigoro and N, in order to secure All for One, he needed to surpass the willpower of every user who held it before. To that end, he searched for a soul that would grind away at their willpower, a quest for the most powerful of emotions, born from the heart's suppression, and planned to cultivate a seedbed for hatred to grow. At some point, he would run a front company called Koga Constructions to continue funding his power. He ended up making contact with Nana's son, Kotaro Shimura, with the two acting friendly toward each other. One time, All for One asked if he would like to see a doctor to help him with his condition, but Kotaro brushed it off as if it wasn't a big deal. He was aware of Kotaro's sad upbringing and disdain for heroes after his mother abandoned him, and told Kotaro about how heroes never show up to aid when they're actually needed, so children need siblings to help each other out. Kotaro took his advice and sired a son named Tenko Shimura. All for One needed a very fragile vessel he could manipulate and take control of, and because Kotaro's daughter Hana was too old, he chose to use Tenko. When he visited the newly born Tenko, All for One stole Tenko's original quirk factor inherited from his parents before it could manifest, leaving the boy quirkless. He proceeded to keep his distance, but subtly forced his way into his life, encouraging Kotaro's harsher treatment and observing Tenko's admiration for heroes. At a dinner another time, All for One asks if Tenko has already manifested a quirk, but Kotaro replies he hasn't yet. One day, when Tenko was 5, he saved his friends from being run over by a truck, and All for One, under the guise of an old man, offered to walk Tenko home. As he held his hand, All for One secretly transferred a quirk to him, Decay. This quirk was derived from the Overhaul quirk, taken from an orphan at one of Kyudai's facilities, in which they stripped it of its ability to reverse its effect, leaving an incomplete copy engineered specifically for destruction. After Tenko accidentally murdered his family during his awakening of his quirk, as well as brutally murdering his abusive father out of revenge, All for One met him under a bridge and granted him a home and safety. He provided Tenko a home and guidance to overcome his violent urges. Kyudai entered the room with Tenko's family's dissected hands, causing the boy to suffer a mental breakdown remembering his family. Kyudai questioned whether All for One should modify Tenko. All for One declines, and that he would teach him how to take his feelings and frustrations and give them purpose. All for One told Tenko that he had an impulse to destroy that couldn't be controlled. He assured him that the impulse didn't have to be controlled, nor was it necessarily a bad thing. One day, Tenko got into a fight with two punks. He was going to fight back and use the decay on them, but backed down. Later, he threw a tantrum while All for One tried to console him, telling him that he should act as his heart commands, otherwise he would suffer for it. He explained that conscience, morals, and ethics were all fabrications, intended to restrain people like them. He asked Tenko one more time what he would like to do. Tenko replied that he wanted to kill the two street thugs, noting that he couldn't hold back his feelings anymore. He disintegrated one of the hands, and All For One smiled and told him to try his best. On a rooftop nearby, All For One and Kyudai watched Tenko murdering the street punks. Kyudai expressed surprise at the events, saying he thought that Tenko had lost his memories. All For One corrected him, noting that the memories were still there, just shut away. He noted that his family's hands would serve to restrain him, keeping all but his negative emotions suppressed. He saw that Tenko is subconsciously keeping his quirk in check. Smiling, All For One expressed pride in seeing Tenko's first step down the path to becoming the symbol of fear, and said that he will cultivate and encourage him on the journey. Later, All For One awarded Tomura 5 new dissected hands, 4 belonging to the 2 thugs he killed, and explained that the 5th is a small bonus to make up for the one he destroyed. He asked Tenko to put on all the new hands and rechristened him Tomura Shigaraki, as Tomura means to mourn and Shigaraki he claims as his own surname. After this, All For One began grooming Tomura as his successor and as the new symbol of fear, knowing that his growing raw hatred could be used to finally steal one for all. The threat of All Might. Toshinori Yagi, Nana's disciple, returned to Japan after a long absence in the United States and soon became All Might, Japan's #1 hero and the symbol of peace. All For One attempted to stop All Might with his soldiers and accomplices, though All Might was able to best all of them, and with his actions, All Might began to dismantle All For One's criminal empire. All For One began to suspect that he would eventually be defeated, so he took several contingency measures in case this could happen, such as sending Gigantomachia away into the woods for hiding. Likewise, in collaboration with Kyudai Garaki, All For One duplicated his own quirk, with the intention of transferring it to Tomura when the time came. In the meantime, Kyudai utilized this duplicate of All For One for various experiments. At some point, All For One recovered the body of the deceased Oboro Shirakumo, and had Kyudai turn him into the Nomu called Kurogiri, who served as their close confidant and assistant. He also at one point was approached by the Aoyama family and asked to give a quirk to their quirkless son, Yuga. He gave him Naval Laser. However, like everyone he made deals with in the past, the Aoyamas were now indebted to All For One and would be forced to follow his commands under fear of death, showing them the bloody remains of those who attempted to act behind his back. All For One and Kyudai also took in many children, which they described as warped, twisted seeds, that they could manipulate as part of their own experiments, as well as use for spare vessels in case anything happened to Tomura. One of these people was a young nameless boy, only known as Experiment Number 6. He suffered from a case of agnosia, having absolutely no awareness of his own self, whether due to a brain defect or childhood trauma. While Kyudai believed his state to be unfit as a pupil, All For One disagreed, seeing his blank slate as someone they could shape like a wad of clay into whatever form he desires, potentially even the twisted entity they seek. All For One showed him videos and visuals of many pro-heroes, telling him to choose whatever quirk and hero most interested him, and to let him take that form. Number 6 chose O'Clock, who All For One complimented him on, telling him to visualize him as his mentor, and that he is the form he's meant to take. Likewise, All For One also went to Sekoto Peak and rescued the burnt remains of Toya Todoroki, seeking to use him as another one of their many spare vessels. Due to the deteriorating state of Toya's body, All For One made all the missing pieces replaced with regenerative tissue. 3 years after rescuing him, Toya had awakened in one of their nurseries where they watched over their spare vessels. They informed Toya that the process of rebuilding his body was a failure, unable to fully make use of his quirk, but still intended to raise him like all the others. However, Toya bluntly refused to be trained by anyone other than his father and managed to escape. All For One and the doctor let him go, unable to control him due to his obsession with his father and believing he will die within a month's time due to the fractured body. The Underground Masquerade. A few years later, in the city of Osaka, All For One organized an illegal fighting event known as the Underground Masquerade. The event helped him move illegal drugs, test different variants of quirk-boosting drugs, and search for interesting quirks worth stealing. His activities attracted the attention of the pro-hero O'Clock, who infiltrated the tournament by posing as a fighter, obtaining evidence of drug trafficking. It also attracted a young Rumi Usagiyama, though she was more interested in fighting, defeating everyone who dared to face her. All For One, who had been watching the fights from the security room, decided to harvest some quirks. He released a gas that empowered the quirks, making those who breathe it go on a rampage. To prevent anyone from fleeing, All For One deployed his subordinates, including a hooded man, and with the help of Kurogiri and his warp gate, he steals those quirks that interest him. All For One was especially eager to get a hold of O'Clock's quirk, Overclock, to give to number 6. The hero allied with Rumi and Kendo Rappa, one of the underground fighters, to escape from there. Their escape was interrupted by the hooded man, leading to a battle between them. All for One was annoyed at being unable to see a clear view of the battle due to most of the security cameras being destroyed, as well as the panicking spectators getting in the way. He contemplates clearing the arena himself, but Kurogiri disagrees, as he believes any further escalation might summon All Might, further irritating All for One. He decides to let the situation settle on its own. When realizing that the hooded man was too difficult a foe to defeat by his own means, O'Clock put in motion an emergency plan, which consisted of Rumi escaping and warning his allies outside to request the assistance of All Might. The plan worked, and All Might immediately left his office to help out in Osaka. Kurogiri informed All for One that since All Might is on the way, they should retreat as to not lose their valuable test subjects, as well as O'Clock. But All for One, annoyed that he couldn't watch the fight between O'Clock and the hooded man, instead requested Kurogiri to assist him in buying some time. After explaining to Kurogiri the dichotomy between heroes and villains, All for One places his hand on several unconscious individuals, utilizing his quirk on each of them to boost their powers, transforming them into violent villains who rampaged in the streets. All for One was satisfied with the results because even All Might would waste time protecting everyone and re-establishing order, but Kurogiri tells him he's gone too far with this action because the incident would serve as a clue that leads back to them. All for One didn't care, arguing that it was a risk well worth the chance to get the overclock quirk. All Might shows up and defeats all the villains in the blink of an eye. Kurogiri relents that All Might's actions barely bought them any time, but All for One gleefully responds that it bought them 3 seconds, more than enough time to be able to get overclock. However, the unexpected intervention of Rumi, who returned to help fight the hooded man, spoiled the plan, leaving him frustrated and displeased. With All Might closing in, Kurogiri uses his quirk to quickly retrieve the hooded man. Once in the hideout, Hood rampages around, yelling that he can still fight, when he's stopped and restrained by All for One. He expressed his disappointment in him, as his strength, agility, and regeneration had greatly weakened after just a few minutes of battle, initially believing his martial arts skills would have got the job done, but that his commitment to brawling messes with his new shape-shifting ability. Using his quirks to shut him down, All for One tells Kurogiri to transport him over to the doctor for further modifications. Despite the failure, All for One keeps calm and reflects that he can be patient, since every step leads him closer to All Might, though he still states that getting his hands on overclock would have furthered the case, saying that it will be his eventually and that he already knows how he'll put it to use. The fall of All for One. All Might and All for One eventually confronted each other in single brutal combat, and for the first time, All for One faced a devastating loss. All Might emerged triumphant, critically injuring All for One by completely decimating his head, though he similarly received a debilitating wound in the process. Incapacitated by his defeat, All for One was nearly dead at the morgue when Kyudai secretly arrived to recover his body. He treated him, and All for One went into hiding as he attempted to heal from his injuries, having Gigantomachia and Kyudai track down useful quirks to help him recover. Kyudai began work at creating a hyper-regeneration quirk, which he believed would be of use to help his condition. However, due to most of his wounds having cauterized, it would have little effect on him. Due to his previous injuries, he was forced to rely on a life support breathing mask and machines to keep him alive. My Hero Academia, Vigilantes. At some point shortly after being injured, the hero O'Clock infiltrated one of his lairs, coming face to face with the villain who snatched his quirk Overclock and wounded his face, leaving a distinctive scar. He would then give overclock to number 6 to let his transformation process begin. During this period of time, All for One began to conduct various experiments towards the general public, all for their goal of creating a being that could rival All Might in power. Just like with the Underground Masquerade, he primarily made use of the trigger drug, using number 6 and the parasitic Queen Bee, Queen Hachisuka, to expose it to the public and examine their out-of-control quirks, turning them into instant villains. Those who most fascinated them would be kidnapped and forced into bioengineering experimentations and body modifications, transforming them into next-level villains, as just another step to test their quirk potentials. All the while as these events occurred, All for One kept a close watch over number 6 under the guise of a mental illusion of his master O'Clock, providing him with advice as some form of conscience. A few years after the failed attack on the Tokyo Sky Egg, number 6 adopts the identity of Rokuro Nomura, becoming the pro-hero known as Rock and managing to become the new manager of Feather Hats, befriending Kazuho Hanayama. Number 6 decides to take advantage of her when she was going through a bad time due to her feelings towards Koichi. Under the guise of O'Clock, All for One mentors number 6 on how to use his overclock quirk to interpret Kazuho's subconscious reactions to say the answers and words Kazuho wants to hear. Thanks to this, he manages to trick her into following him into an abandoned building and making her the Queen Bee's new host. With Kazuho turned into Bee Pop, With Kazuho turned into B-Pop, All for One observes number 6 carry out his plan to sacrifice her in order to kill Koichi, all as a part of his heroic origin story as the pro-hero O'Clock 2. But the plan fails. Koichi manages to rescue Kazuho, being taken to a hospital where the Queen Bee is extracted from inside her, and number 6 ends up seriously injured. Filled with hatred, the villain swears to Koichi that he will take revenge by killing him and Kazuho. As the first step of his plan, number 6 infiltrates the police department, disposing of Aizo Tanuma and the information he had collected, connecting All for One to the current events in Naruhara. O'Clock congratulates him on his approach, striking first to erase every trace of the past so that the powers that be will be unable to make a move. Number 6 then proceeds to start his revenge scheme, known as Operation Anonymous. Taking advantage of the heroes, police, and vigilantes fighting each other, number 6 sends his anonymous drones throughout the city to execute the plan, with O'Clock reminding him that teamwork is key to prevent your enemies from teaming up and ensure your side are all on the same page. After disabling communications in the city, number 6 sends the Anonymous throughout Naruhara to disrupt the heroes and civilians, causing enough trouble to create a sense of unease, but not too much to call upon upper-level heroes like All Might. He uses the distraction to storm Kazuho's hospital, with O'Clock admiring his smart thinking at leaving the Anonymous outside the building, so as not to distract from his use of overclock or letting them inadvertently explode inside. However, he is further distracted by the combined force of Soga Kugisaki with a submachine gun and Koichi Himawari's repulsion blasts. O'Clock notes how, with the blasts being sprayed around, they aren't intending to seriously injure him, just force him to overuse his quirk and run out of oxygen. Number 6 is temporarily restrained by the police, but he uses his transformative abilities to slip out of his cuffs. O'Clock warns him about watching out for Soga, and then once Koichi starts blasting at him with rapid shots, O'Clock points out how annoying they are to deal with, and recommends retreating so he doesn't go out of breath, which number 6 reluctantly does. Reconvening outside, number 6 spots Koichi blasting off into the sky, causing O'Clock to realize he's leaving to summon All Might, warning him that they'll only have about 60 seconds until he arrives. Despite this, O'Clock is confident in number 6's abilities, since in that time he can easily sneak to the hospital, eliminate Kazuho, and escape, embracing his anonymity. Number 6, however, disagrees with this notion, as doing so would only leave him as nameless and faceless as ever, so he decides to indulge himself and massacre everyone, just as Koichi returns right behind him. After talking between each other, the two begin to fight, with number 6 catching Koichi off guard and seemingly destroying him with a knuckle bomb punch. However, to his surprise, Koichi emerges from the explosion relatively fine, with O'Clock reminding number 6 that there must be an unknown factor at play, and to observe in detail rather than using back into attack. They realize that Koichi has been using his slide and glide quirk to repel the explosions, and recognizing his speed, maneuverability, and flight, O'Clock suggests a hasty retreat. Number 6 irritatingly refuses this warning and begins to give chase with the Vigilante. As Koichi continues to dodge each of number 6's attacks, O'Clock surmises that he had managed to lure number 6 away from the hospital, and still intends on seeking All Might's help, with number 6 taking the bait, something he is painfully aware of already. Number 6 confronts Koichi about how he's able to match his every movement, which he is unable to properly answer, causing O'Clock to note how he isn't playing dumb, meaning that he must be handling the overclock attacks subconsciously. Equating Koichi's luckiness to button mashing, number 6 decides to go in for a rush attack, blasting Koichi with a flurry of punches which he attempts to deflect. O'Clock informs him that his quantity over quality tactic is ill-advised, as the essence of O'Clock is acceleration of one's thought process, which allows them to deliberately choose the optimal action every time, but without strength akin to All Might, a head-on approach won't be effective. Number 6 ignores this advice and continues the assault, but Koichi is able to block and deflect every single attack. Bewildered by how he's managed to match overclock speed, O'Clock figures out what's going on. He talks about how the human body will often take action without waiting for a conscious decision to be made, and that Koichi's subconscious actions follow this line of thought. He continues that while number 6's brain can process thoughts faster than anyone, Koichi's body can act even faster than his thoughts. O'Clock suggests number 6 abandon the mission and retreat, while also stressing not to encounter Koichi again. He states that with his superior quirk, which grants him high-speed movement, ranged attacks, and defensive force fields, as well as these subconscious reflexes to trigger them all when needed, while he may be only able to flee and dodge currently, in the days to come, if he perfects these abilities, he will become the perfect foil, a foe like All Might to be avoided. Number 6, however, angrily rejects this statement, declaring executing Koichi to now be the only thing that matters to him, transforming into a giant spider-like creature known as the High Crawler. Thanks to the modifications to his body, the Highcrawler form allows number 6 to utilize Overclock indefinitely, allowing him finally the opportunity to overwhelm Koichi. Despite this, O'Clock advises him against his tactics, as thanks to Koichi's years as a vigilante, unlike most pros, he's always been on the defensive side, meaning that he's developed a fight or flight response to any fight, a variant fighter trained to counter any attack. O'Clock tells him he's too focused on mimicking O'Clock's fighting style and needs to come up with another plan to catch Koichi off guard. Their plan is to distract him long enough to be harassed by the mob of remaining anonymous, using his control with Overclock to overwhelm him on all sides. All for One then starts to think to himself that changing targets has come at a considerable cost, and while he considers the mission a failure, the experiment has taken an intriguing turn, gleefully telling number 6 to follow his twisted path, seek his culmination, and surpass his every limit. He attempts to snipe at Koichi from afar, but is attacked by Knuckle Duster, the real O'Clock, and through their skirmish, Koichi ends up blasting him and number 6 in the sky, before the villain once again changes tactics. Combusting the bomber cells within his body into plasma energy, number 6 transforms into his lightning-style form, granting him the power of flight. Finally shedding his O'Clock disguise, All for One is surprised by number 6's action, praising how his admiration for heroes has set him on this path, and his rage has allowed him to maximize his potential, no longer operating to his whims, but taking flight of his own free will, the greatest guinea pig he could ask for. With how much the fight has escalated, All for One criticizes number 6 for how bombastic it has become, calling Operation Anonymous a total failure and telling him to move on to the retrieval phase. However, number 6 disagrees, as all he wants and needs to do is kill Koichi with all the strength he can muster, his sole remaining desire. All for One gleefully lets number 6 show him how brightly his existence can burn. All for One watches on as number 6 proceeds to fuse together himself with all the remaining bomber cells of the Anonymouses, witnessing his final shining act, the powerful incarnation he's long desired. Transforming into the form known as Destruction Style, All for One looks on at the portrait of hell as he witnesses the Anonymous and their bomber cells combusting, transferring all their power to number 6 as All for One asks if this is the concept of a true hero. Transformed into a gigantic flaming humanoid, number 6 violently attacks Koichi, managing to seriously injure him, forcing the young vigilante to escape. After Koichi escapes into a building to hide from the now giant number 6, All for One reminds him that his target is a master of hide and seek, and he'll be trickier to hit underneath the building, asking what his next move is. Seeing his decision to destroy the building into nothing, All for One gleefully states that he's reached the conclusion just like his old chum, smashing everything to dust with overwhelming violence. All for One watches on as an enraged number 6 endlessly bangs on the rubble of the building Koichi was hiding in, all to ensure that he's dead, when there's a sudden explosion and Koichi emerges from the debris, apparently without too many major wounds and ready to face number 6 one more time. As soon as he sees that he's alive, number 6 attacks Koichi, who dodges his blows until he can finally fight back with the new technique he's developed, Knuckle Style, piercing number 6's body. The villain regenerates his wound, but Koichi continues to use his new technique to constantly attack him, ripping his body apart each time. Although number 6 regenerates or reattaches the missing parts, Koichi keeps the villain at bay until help can arrive. Seeing such skill, All for One begins to observe Koichi, examining how his slide and glide quirk is a simple one with force fields that can repulse or absorb in some way, remarking on his relative mastery of the quirk, while also noting the quirk itself is the height of mediocrity. He notes that the occasional high output bursts are fleeting, and that he runs out of steam shortly afterward, and that it's simply just a polished use of a quirk that lacks any decisive power. At least that's what he thought. Noticing the extremely powerful punches Koichi has started to execute with his quirk, All for One reflects on how it is far more than should be possible, likely drawing from a source of passion which he's imbuing his fists with. He thinks about how his quirk has begun to reveal its true potential, wondering if he was disguising it as a weak quirk the whole time, or if his trial has triggered explosive growth, asking him what drives him and what obsession spurred him to evolve. Number 6 seemingly manages to put an end to Koichi, with All for One congratulating him, while lamenting no body means no sample to retrieve. Despite that, he considers it as a whole to be a worthwhile experiment, discovering Koichi's latent potential, even though he couldn't best number 6's tenacity. He congratulates him on his victory, and even though he'll soon lose control of the combustion process and burn away to nothing, he's shone a glorious light on his future. However, they're both further shocked to discover Koichi's still alive and kicking, and their battle resumes. All for One observes their fighting, calling it akin to frolicking within their exchange of passionate blows. He wonders where all their energy is coming from and what their quirks are tapping into, as it's nothing he can comprehend. He is desperate to know how to reach this domain beyond the singularity when he hears Knuckle Duster behind him, telling him that a collector such as him would never understand. All for One turns around to see who spoke to him, but he doesn't see anyone. Despite one last-ditch attempt to finish everything off by exploding into several mini-bombers, number 6 is done in by the arrival of all the pro heroes, specifically All Might and Endeavor. Despite this, his main body is able to escape, with All for One confronting the skeletal remains. He notes another crisis has been averted by All Might's meddling, but still commends number 6's creativity. How he was even able to outmaneuver All Might at the last minute, stating that now no one can stop him and the world is his oyster. Number 6 slowly begins to rebuild his body, stumbling between the crowds of civilians using his overclock speed to keep himself out of sight, all while All for One reflects on his current burnt-up display, stating that without enough bomber cells, his combustion ended before completion, but still should be capable of achieving his final goal. He reminds number 6 that his specialty lies with Operation Anonymous, and with the heroes believing to have defeated the threat, he is once again the Invisible Man, and able to finish the crawler with no one the wiser. They manage to locate Koichi on a nearby rooftop, with All for One telling him to do one quick strike to kill him, also telling him to collect his body for him to study. He gleefully says to kill Koichi for him, but instead number 6 ignores his request, transforming into his Rokuro Nomura face to speak with Koichi and brushing All for One's visage away. After their conversation, number 6 scratches Koichi as a way of leaving a mark on the world before he leaves it, exploding in one final detonation. Due to these events, All for One decides to do some research on Koichi's history, but finds nothing extraordinary about him. He's just an utterly average guy, born from ordinary parents and with a monotonous upbringing, and yet he managed to capitalize a powerful quirk and abnormal battle prowess. The idea that circumstance, experience, and sheer force of will could turn a man into Superman invalidates the methodology behind Operation Anonymous. Coming to this conclusion, All for One wonders how he will be able to respond when civilians start taking heroic action. If extraordinary potential is available to anyone, it may be a path to chaos, but it also introduces uncertainty into his machinations. Despite this, All for One tells to Kyudai and Kurogiri that they have to pour their efforts into their next plan. Should society reach the point where heroes can appear from anywhere, he'll command an entity that can face any hero head-on through its own individual might. In a status tube, he looks upon their bioengineered Nomu, saying that he was led to this culmination by number 6 himself. All for One continued to groom Tomura as his successor, well aware that Tomura was really the grandson of Nana Shimura, and wanted to use this to his advantage. He also assigned Kurogiri with serving and overseeing Tomura's development, warning Kurogiri to use Gigantomachia once he believes to no longer be capable of ensuring Tomura's safety. Sometime prior to the start of the school year, he created the League of Villains, an organization for Tomura to run and enlist villains to aid in his cause, while acting as a front for his true goals. Shortly before the start of the school year, he learned a rumor that All Might would become a teacher at UA, so he called upon the Aoyamas, informing Yuga to apply there, intending to use him as his mole. U.S.J. Arc. All for One's first command for Yuga was to discover and report when the class and All Might would be isolated together. Thanks to a distraction caused by Tomura, he informed him that All Might would be teaching them while at the unforeseen simulation joint, leading All for One and Kyudai to supply Tomura and Kurogiri with an army of no-name thugs to act as their League of Villains, but also their perfected Nomu, designed to kill All Might once and for all. Unfortunately, their plan fails, and Kurogiri is forced to warp himself and an injured Tomura back to their hideout at the last second, allowing them to escape from being defeated. Tomura berates over his failure, his injuries, losing their subordinates, his Nomu being defeated, and All Might surviving. However, All for One, speaking on the monitor, says that nothing went wrong and that he was simply over-optimistic. Tomura mentions one kid in particular who kept getting in the way, and had a power similar to All Might's, which interests All for One. He says that it's too late to mourn and that they should gather up a new group hand-picked for efficiency, saying that they should take all the time they need. All for One tells Tomura that he's a symbol of importance and that next time he will show the world the horror of his existence. UA Sports Festival Arc. A recuperating Tomura watches the UA Sports Festival, including the obstacle race where he sees Izuku take first place. Later on, before the battle between Izuku and Shoto Todoroki begins, All for One tells Tomura to pay close attention to their match, as they might become obstacles for him in the future. Tomura responds by telling his master not to make him laugh. Versus Hero Killer Arc. All for One, using his monitor to speak through, orders Kurogiri to allow Stain and Tomura to continue talking, saying that Tomura's meeting with Stain, an experienced infamous villain, will stimulate Tomura's growth. Before he leaves for Hosu, Tomura asks All for One to let him borrow some Nomu because he does not like the hero killer Stain, and that destroying things he does not like seems alright. All for One decides to give Tomura 3 Nomu, hoping that Tomura will make the opportunity a learning experience. In the aftermath of the incident, 2 of the Nomu are killed, 1 is detained, and Stain is captured. The latter surprises All for One, but he is still happy that things are going as he has foreseen. He exclaims that Tomura's position is to supervise and unify the new villains who have come to join the League of Villains. Dr. Garaki expresses doubt that Tomura can do his job and says that if All for One stepped in, things would be proceeding faster. All for One proceeds to ask the doctor to patch him up faster, adding that he will let Tomura do all the hard work so that he may become his successor as Tomura was born to do. All for One tells All Might to rejoice in the transient peace while he still can. My Hero Academia, 2 heroes. Learning about David Shield's plan to break into Island during its expo, All for One contacted Wolfram, the villain hired to assist in the scheme, and provided him with additional muscle augmentation quirk, wanting to have a hand in All Might's former partner's fall to villainy. Forest Training Camp Arc. Thanks to an interaction between Izuku and Tomura, UA decided to change at the last minute the location of the upcoming Quirk training camp, to keep it a secret from potential villain attacks. Despite this, All for One was able to figure it out by commanding Yuga to reveal the location, the information he promptly gave to Tomura to use. Hideout Raid Arc. After the Vanguard Action Squad's successful capture of Katsuki Bakugo and Ragdoll, All for One promptly stole the latter's search quirk. He then had Dr. Garaki once again replicate his quirk, believing he may be defeated soon, receiving a copy of the All for One quirk for himself, while the original was kept by the doctor, with the intention of passing down to Tomura when he's ready. After Katsuki attacks Tomura in defiance of joining their cause, Tomura understands that mere words alone won't convince Katsuki to join them, and decides to ask for the force of his teacher to help him convince Katsuki. All for One, who has been watching Tomura on his computer, commends his apprentice for this wise decision. The League of Villains is soon apprehended by the pro-heroes and police force. All for One decides to take action himself, emerging at the Nomu manufacturing warehouse and apologizes to Tiger, explaining that Ragdoll is in a comatose state because he stole her quirk, Search, which he finds to be quite useful. Best Jeanist restrains All for One with his quirk and orders his fellow pro-heroes not to let the villain do anything. Before the pros can act, the entire warehouse is completely destroyed and the surrounding area suffers extensive damage as well. All for One had unleashed a blast wave that seemingly killed the pro heroes, destroyed the warehouse, and dealt significant damage to the surrounding area in less than a second. All for One is livid with the heroes for interfering with his apprentice, who has started thinking for himself as well as leading others by himself in hopes they no longer bother him. All for One decides to quickly resolve the mess created by the heroes. All for One uses a warping quirk to produce a black liquid at the League of Villains hideout. The black liquid summons dozens of Nomu inside and outside the hideout, forcing the pro-heroes and police force to confront the legions of Nomu. This black liquid also teleports the League of Villains and Katsuki away. All for One discovers the pro-heroes have survived his attack. All for One claps and praises Best Jeanist for using his quirk to pull his fellow heroes out of the way in order to reduce the blast's impact on them. Despite his heavy injuries, Best Jeanist attempts to fight back and begins sending fiber strings. However, All for One impales Best Jeanist from afar. The mighty villain mentions that he does not need his quirk because it does not suit Tomura's personality. Tomura, Kurogiri, the Vanguard Action Squad, and Katsuki all materialize from the black liquid in front of All for One. The villain sees that his apprentice has failed again, however, All for One is neither angry nor disappointed with Tomura and encourages him to try again, since he still has the Vanguard Action Squad and Katsuki, whom he deemed important. All for One implores Tomura to continue trying as many times as he likes since everything is for his sake. Suddenly, All Might appears above him and attacks. However, All for One blocks his attack as All Might declares that he will take everything back, while All for One wonders if All Might will attempt to kill him again. All Might and All for One clash, which creates a shockwave that sends Katsuki, Tomura, and the Vanguard Action Squad backwards. Both All for One and All Might criticize each other for becoming weaker. All Might declares that he will save Katsuki and will not repeat the same mistake as he did 6 years ago, and this time he will definitely put All for One behind bars along with the League of Villains. All Might charges at his arch-nemesis, but All for One sends another huge blast wave at All Might, causing the symbol of peace to be sent flying away with great force. All for One's blast wave attack not only hits All Might, but destroys several buildings in the process. Katsuki becomes concerned, but All for One tells Katsuki not to fret since his blast wave attack is not strong enough to kill All Might. All for One orders Tomura to escape along with Katsuki and comments that his black liquid warping quirk will not be able to help Tomura and the League of Villains escape. All for One uses a quirk that forcefully activates Kurogiri's warp gate, which causes a portal to open. All for One orders the League of Villains to escape into Kurogiri's portal. Suddenly, All Might reappears onto the battlefield, refusing to allow the arch-villain to escape and charges at him. Before heading into battle, All for One tells Tomura that he can grow stronger still. All Might and All for One clash once again, while Katsuki tries to fend off some of the Vanguard Action Squad trying to apprehend him. All Might attempts to help Katsuki, only for All for One to intervene and stop him. Suddenly, Izuku, Eijiro Kirishima, and Tenya Ida appear above them in the air. All for One sees the trio and attempts to attack them, but All Might intervenes by punching him. Katsuki manages to use this opportunity to escape along with Izuku and his friends. Now that the tables have turned, All for One sees that they can no longer secure victory due to Katsuki's rescue, and that most of the Vanguard Action Squad is unconscious. All for One decides to save Tomura and the Vanguard Action Squad, forcefully activating Magna's magnetism quirk. Before Tomura can stop, he and the Vanguard Action Squad are magnetically pulled into Kurogiri's warp gate. As he's being sucked into the warp gate, Tomura calls out to his teacher, concerned for his safety. Before Tomura teleports away, All for One tells Tomura to continue the fight. Tomura and the unconscious Kurogiri are teleported away by the warp gate, causing the portal to disperse. All Might charges at All for One, but All for One uses his warping quirk to teleport Gran Torino in front of him, using the elderly hero as a human shield, which causes Gran Torino to take All Might's attack instead. All for One expresses his hatred for All Might as he is the one who brought down his comrades in the past, and while he descended into darkness, All Might rose to the top as the symbol of peace. All for One prepares to fire his Blast Wave move, intending to blow away Gran Torino and All Might at the same time. However, All Might pulls Gran Torino away and uses a Detroit Smash to cancel out All for One's Blast Wave move. All for One sees that his destruction of the city has brought chaos and decides to put the innocent civilians in danger so that All Might will not be able to fight at full strength. Furious with All for One's sadism, All Might grabs his arm while throwing Gran Torino away to safety. All Might admonishes All for One for the despicable crimes he's committed and for his misanthropy. All Might punches All for One in the face, shattering his mask. However, All Might's punch was not strong enough to finish him off. As Gran Torino calls out to him, All Might's face reverts to its true form, reaching to his limits. All for One says that All Might would not be the first to criticize him, as he has heard those same lines before from the previous one-for-all successor, Nana Shimura. All Might is angry at the arch-villain mentioning her name, as All for One notes that Nana was all bark and no bite, only going on about her ideals and was not even strong. He mocks her for her uselessness and mentions that she died in an embarrassing, shameful way. Infuriated, All Might prepares to attack All for One, but he proceeds to use his Blast Wave technique against All Might, causing the hero to be blasted into the air. Gran Torino catches All Might and lands him safely to the ground. All for One decides to finish his apprentice's hard work and sever the trust in heroes once and for all. He once again expresses his hatred for All Might due to taking something away from him and wants him to die in the most gruesome way possible. He fires another Wave Blast attack at All Might, who, seeing that an innocent civilian is trapped under rubble behind him, blocks All for One's attack and saves the civilian from being harmed. However, All Might expends the last of his power and reverts to his true form. All for One relishes in the fact that All Might's true form has been exposed for all to see. Everyone in the country sees All Might's true form and begins panicking. All for One mocks All Might for the pitiful state he's in. However, All Might does not care about his rotting body nor his exposure to the world and declares that his spirit burns strongly, which is what truly matters. Wanting to break his spirit even more, All for One reveals that Tomura is Nana's grandson. All Might is completely shocked by this information and refuses to believe it, but All for One tells him that it's the truth. All for One wonders why All Might is not smiling and sarcastically remarks about All Might's smile, which is something Nana would always do. All Might's spirit is greatly demoralized by the mockery, while All for One continues relishing in All Might's pitiful state. Invigorated by the civilians, All Might activates One for All throughout the right side of his body, transforming it into his hero form. All Might smiles and states that heroes have many things to protect, which is why they do not lose. All for One deduces that All Might will unleash his final attack, commenting that wounded heroes are the most terrifying of all. All for One's comment causes him to reminisce about their last battle, where All Might delivered the final blow to him, and admits that the look on All Might's face during that last attack has still haunted him to this very day. All for One prepares to fire his Blast Wave attack when suddenly flames strike at the mighty villain, which All for One uses another Blast Wave attack to swat away the flames with ease. All for One is surprised by the appearance of Endeavor and Edgeshot, specifically how they were able to make hasty work of the Nomu much faster than he anticipated, and that he shouldn't have taken Endeavor's number 2 rank so lightly. Annoyed with the pro-hero's interference, All for One prepares his Blast Wave attack again. However, Edgeshot uses his quirk and great speed to attack, but All for One dodges the attack. Growing impatient with the sentimental talk, All for One blasts Endeavor and Edgeshot back and activates a number of his strongest quirks in his right arm, causing it to become an enlarged, mutated arm filled with numerous deadly screws and hardened minerals. All for One charges at All Might with his heavily empowered and mutated arm. While heading towards All Might, All for One knows from battling him means that All Might no longer has One for All, and that he is simply fighting with the remaining embers that have yet to be extinguished. He further tells All Might that he knows whom he gave One for All to, Izuku Midoriya, having deduced it from Tomura's report about the boy. All for One taunts All Might by saying he has also failed as a teacher towards Izuku due to his apprentice's recklessness and prepares to kill him. Both All for One and All Might clash by punching each other with their enhanced fists, which creates a huge shockwave that devastates a great portion of the city. As they struggle, All for One uses his impact recoil quirk to revert all the damage to All Might. However, All Might transfers One for All to his other arm, sacrificing his right arm but rendering impact recoil ineffective. All Might says that he must indeed criticize Izuku for his actions, while All for One is shocked that All Might would go to such lengths to protect his leftovers of One for All and admits that he miscalculated. All Might refuses to die until he's finished bringing up Izuku, and then counters by throwing his empowered left arm and punches All for One, who has left his guard open. The punch, however, was meant to lower All for One's guard, and All Might transfers One for All to his right arm and prepares for his final attack, United States of Smash, which creates a great shockwave when it hits All for One, destroying half of the city. After the dust clears, All for One is in a crater, badly beaten and unconscious. Later, Endeavor and All Might watch All for One being placed in the Iron Maiden. The next day, All for One is incarcerated into Tartarus, a special prison for criminals for whom the death penalty is not enough. All for One, in a wheelchair and on life support, wonders where he is, much to the prison guard's annoyance, who is pushing him to his holding cell. The prison guard tells him his location. All for One apologizes, causing the prison guard to assume that he is blind. All for One reveals that for the past 6 years he's been using an infrared quirk to sense his surroundings as a way to compensate for his blindness, but due to all the sensors he is unable to sense anything and apologizes to the prison guard. The prison guard is flabbergasted that All for One fought All Might in such a condition. While being pushed to his holding cell, All for One is not angry or upset for losing against All Might. Instead, All for One is happy because his defeat at All Might's hand will grow Tomura's hatred for All Might, as well as his regret for being unable to save his master, which will motivate him to gain experience and become much stronger. All for One smiles, knowing that even though he lost the battle, he will still succeed at being the better teacher than All Might, and that his successor will come out on top. Provisional Hero License Exam Arc. During the Provisional Hero License Exam, All for One receives a visit from All Might. All for One comments on the severe strictness of the prison he's being held in, that even if he were to try and activate a quirk, he'd be put down instantly. All Might assures All for One that he will never escape, nor is he getting out anytime soon from this prison of hell. Moving along, All for One questions again what All Might wants. The former hero wants to know the whereabouts of Tomura, which the villain answers he doesn't know, and unlike him, he has already let Tomura carry on. All Might proceeds to question him about his motives, but the villain claims All Might is never going to be satisfied by his answers. All for One makes his answers simple. Both he and All Might are the same. All for One wishes to be the king of evil in the same way that All Might wants to be the symbol of peace. All Might asks if All for One wanted to live forever being utterly evil. All Might asks if All for One wanted to live forever being utterly evil, and if so, then why does he need a successor? All for One finds All Might's question funny, answering that All Might took everything away from him, leaving him in a regrettable state to the point that he needs complex devices to survive. Because of this, his influence and ideals have become limited thanks to him, so he has been grooming Tomura to become his successor and carry on his legacy. The security inform All Might that he has 3 minutes left, much to All for One's disappointment, as he still has much more to say. Due to All Might's retirement, the villain asks about the state of the outside world, but security informs All Might that he cannot tell him any information that is going on in the world. All for One decides to posit a hypothesis then. With All Might's retirement, Endeavor has become the new #1 hero. However, it does not seem that it will be enough to contain the anxiety and concern of society, and sensing the growing insecurity in the world, the villains will rise up, believing it to be their chance to change society. In this situation, Tomura and his allies will grow in power and influence to reach the top, although they will have to clash with other organizations that intend to do the same, clashes in which All Might will be unable to do anything. All for One mockingly asks All Might how it feels to be absolutely powerless. His words make All Might angry, who replies to All for One not to presume everything. All Might understood that he chose Tomura as his successor because he was the grandson of his master Nana, but he will not allow All for One's twisted vision to be realized, and he won't let himself be killed by Tomura. All for One wonders if All Might came here to tell him that. As he leaves, All Might tells All for One he will smash his plans as many times as it takes, and he will pass the rest of his life in prison. As the prison cell begins closing, All for One chuckles at All Might's final statement. Pro-Hero Arc. All for One claims that he is willing to restore Ragdoll's quirk, but that it would require activating his own quirk to do so. The authorities determine that the safest approach is to not let him do anything while investigating the number of quirks he has stockpiled. A few days later, Izuku experiences the vestiges of One for All, where he views a flashback between All for One and Yoichi, the first user of One for All. He witnesses All for One transfer the stockpiling quirk to his brother, out of kindness as well as to force him to submit. All for One claims that he was creating a reality just like the one in the comics the brothers used to read as kids. He also tells his brother that by accepting a quirk, he would start seeing reality as it is. Joint Training Arc. In Tartarus, one of the prison guards grows anxious regarding All for One's presence, wondering when his sentence will be finalized, with the other stating that it's been delayed due to unknown factors like Gigantomachia and the League still being at large, and not wanting to make All for One into a martyr for the villains. All for One suddenly starts to speak, shocking the guards, and apologizes for setting off the alarms due to feeling uneasy due to having started to reminisce about things from his past, claiming to hear his younger brother's voice. Paranormal Liberation War Arc. While investigating and analyzing Kurogiri, who they had captured several months ago, Naomasa Tsukauchi and Gran Torino find out that he is a Nomu created from the corpse of Oboro Shirakumo. When they question All for One about his methods to create the Nomu, the villain simply responds with a metaphor, in which he compares the creation of the Nomu as producing wine, trampling grapes, people to extract the juice, quirks, and letting them ferment into wine, Nomu. Later, Naomasa and Gran Torino ask Shota Aizawa and Hisashi Yamada for help to awaken Oboro's consciousness. Although it was an emotionally painful process, they succeed and obtain vital information. This, along with other data obtained by Hawks, allows the heroes to locate Tomura, who is at the Jaku General Hospital, undergoing a complex and extensive operation at the hands of Kyudai Garaki to obtain more power, transplanting the original All for One quirk to him. To avoid this, the heroes raid the hospital a month before the operation ends, as well as the bases of the Paranormal Liberation Front, a formation between the League of Villains and the Meta Liberation Army. Not without great difficulties, the heroes manage to reach the secret laboratory under the hospital and prevent Kyudai from awakening Tomura prematurely, destroying the machine that kept them alive, with even Kyudai believing that his master's dream has ended due to Tomura appearing to be dead. While Tomura is in a state of apparent death, he enters a dream world where he sees and interacts with representations of his relatives, until a shadowy vestige of All for One appears, telling him to come to him. Tomura's family reappears to stop him, even his grandmother Nana, yet despite their pleas to not fall to the darkness, Tomura rejects them and embraces his master. Tomura unexpectedly awakens and immediately uses his empowered decay to destroy the hospital, killing dozens of heroes in the process and even destroying much of the nearby city. After this, he orders Gigantomachia to come to him, bringing the members of the League with him, but he also begins to hear a voice inside his head that orders him to go get the One for All quirk. Tomura is confused by this, but soon ignores it as he begins to be attacked by Endeavor and other heroes. Even so, the voice inside him insists again, and compelled by it, Tomura uses his search quirk to locate One for All, discovering it in possession of Izuku, heading towards him. Tomura manages to reach him, starting a bloody battle between him against Izuku, Katsuki, Endeavor, Shota Aizawa, Gran Torino, and several other heroes. To prevent more heroes from interfering, Tomura summons a group of Nomu to confront the reinforcements. While this is all happening, All for One is seen smiling within his cell. While facing Izuku, Tomura ends up calling him little brother, a statement that leaves both of them confused. This allows Tomura to realize that the mysterious inner voice comes from the ego of his master that exists within All for One, who tries to take over his will. Tomura thanks his master for raising him from the bottom of his heart, but refuses to be controlled by him, as he wants to be greater than All for One was, and breaks free from his image in his mind. However, the heroes begin to get the upper hand in the battle, and when Tomura is burned alive by Endeavor's prominence burn, All for One's vestige reaches out his hand and suggests Tomura hand his body over. He appears to do so as suddenly a completely entombed Tomura attacks Endeavor, stabbing him with his rivet stab quirk that emerges from his back. The wounded Endeavor wonders how he can stay alive before he starts falling to the ground. Tomura then turns his attention back to Izuku, calling him little brother, and attacks him with the rivet stab. Katsuki pushes Izuku out of the way and gets impaled by the tendrils instead. Tomura attempts to wrestle back control over his body, while All for One comments that of all the blood shed during the battle, Katsuki's was the most pointless. This causes Izuku to snap and attack Tomura directly, blinded by rage. Tomura himself is shocked by this, but All for One's vestige within him is delighted and manages to take control of Tomura's body again. Izuku was so enraged that he was careless, so Tomura is able to grab a hold of him and uses All for One to try and steal One for All. Instead, Izuku ends up within a vestige world where he sees All for One fused with Tomura, where Tomura demands All for One not to interfere, but All for One sneers that if it weren't for his intervention, Tomura would be dead. Suddenly, Nana Shimura appears beside Izuku, pestered to see All for One again as the villain introduces her to Tomura, mockingly exclaiming how his dead grandmother has joined them. He begins to explain the reason for the presence of the vestiges, both from the previous users of One for All and from the original owners of the quirks stolen by All for One. He goes on to tell them how when he stole quirks, he could hear voices, which caused him to feel some semblance of guilt. However, once he relinquished the quirk, the voices would go away. It wasn't until he had met Dr. Garaki that he realized it was the vestiges of the previous owners he had heard, similar to how organs and cells contain a person's DNA. All for One admits he thought he was the only person that could do this, and realizes when his quirk merged with his younger brother's, it granted him and anyone else who had One for All the ability as well. Then, after finishing his speech, All for One suggests both Nana and Tomura to greet each other. Nana recognizes Tomura as Kotaro's son, but Tomura simply retorts that none of it matters since he hates her too, and begins eroding the vestige world, forcing Nana to protect Izuku. All for One gleefully states that Tomura's rage is overwhelming One for All's will, noticing that this also includes Tomura's hatred for All for One himself, which he is pleased as it makes him worthy of being the symbol of chaos. Just then, Yoichi appears and helps Nana push back Tomura's anger. He asks his brother if Tomura is just the next person he's manipulating, while All for One says he wishes he had made his brother his, but that Yoichi refuses to join him. All for One forces Tomura to combine their powers together to take One for All, stating that Izuku is unworthy since he couldn't protect him. Yoichi says they deem Izuku worthy, and All for One will never understand why, as he and Nana counter All for One and Tomura, causing Izuku and Tomura to separate and regain consciousness. All for One tells Tomura that they fail and they must retreat to let his body reach 100%, but Tomura refuses and decides to stay and fight against All for One's insistence. All for One takes note of Gigantomachia's arrival and states that he came back just in the nick of time before Tomura falls unconscious. Spinner, who is tending to Tomura, remembers what his leader had said before about the hands of his deceased family bringing him a sickening rage, and puts one of those hands onto Tomura's face. This allows Tomura to reawaken, though All for One is now in full control. He remarks on how his successor found himself some truly great allies, and that the hatred in Tomura's heart serves as a power that gives the vestige of All for One an even greater hold over Tomura's body. All for One uses his radio waves to order the near high-end Nomu to take Tomura's body and retreat. When Spinner reminds All for One of their allies still fighting, the villain coldly states that since Tomura lost, it's only fair that he pays for that loss and subsequently abandons the remaining members. Just before they leave, Miria, Nejire Shoto, and Tenya try to stop him, but he easily blasts them all away before being rescued by the near high-end Nomu. Izuku attempts to stop All for One, but the villain easily blasts him away with an air cannon and tells the hero that they will meet again once Tomura's body is perfected. The vestige of All for One retreats with the remaining 10 near high-end Nomu, accompanied by Spinner and a compressed Dabi and Skeptic. The surviving heroes try to stop them, but All for One dispatches 3 of the Nomus to confront them. The near high-end's distraction tactics ensured that he, his allies, and 7 others escaped, while those 3 were destroyed. A few hours later, in Tartarus, the real All for One is able to sense the condition of Tomura's body, noting that while his expectations were slightly off, it wouldn't be much longer. In the forest, the vestige of All for One remarks that the heroes won't get a tomorrow or the chance to get a moment's rest, since it's his turn to lead, ordering the near high-ends to invade Tartarus to free his real body. All for One in Tomura's body alongside the near high-ends start to invade Tartarus. They destroy the bronze gate as the bridge is lowered, halting them from entering. The near high-ends deal with the defending drones while All for One flies over on a flying Nomu. Tomura starts to wake up, leading to an argument between the two over control of the body. All for One reminds him that he's doing everything for his sake because Tomura will become the next me. As All for One struggles to break through, due to the immense amount of security in Tartarus and Tomura's increasingly failing body, he figures the only way to success is through a coordinated attack inside and out, and that he'll need help from villains. All for One proceeds to hit Tartarus with several radio wave attacks from outside in Tomura's body, shutting down the prison security, followed immediately by another radio waves attack on the inside by himself in his original body, unlocking his and all the other cells on the floor, as the previously captured villains quickly disposed of the armed guards. The vestige and original All for One use radio waves to communicate with each other, telling each other their intention to have Tomura's procedure completed within 38 days. The freed, albeit still on life support All for One then finally reunites with Tomura, in front of the rest of the prisoners, telling them to join him on his path of devastation to become the greatest demon lord. To the majority of inmates, All for One tells them to be free and to cause as much chaos as they want. He then approaches Lady Nagant, telling her it was an honor to meet the treacherous hero, while she reminisces how he was one of her targets back in the day. He requests her to hunt down a specific target, Izuku Midoriya, sure that he will leave UA, and asks her to capture and bring him to him. He also warns her that surely some of the best heroes will be watching over him from a distance, so he recommends that she take her time until they're split up enough, with waiting for a rainy day to be her best bet. Lady Nagant interrupts him by asking why she is the only one with an assignment while the other inmates can just go wild. All for One reminds her how she killed a fellow hero and that she wants the Hero Society to collapse as well, and as long as Izuku remains, that dream will never come to pass. All for One notices the mentally broken Kaichisaki muttering about his boss, and asks if he's a friend of hers. She denies this, but brings him with her because she believes he will be useful to her in some way despite his mental state, as All for One identifies him as another victim of the wicked Hero Society. Nevertheless, Lady Nagant agrees to help All for One, and to seal the deal he offers a gift, transferring Airwalk to her. After telling her to deliver the target within 2 months to a mansion in Hibori Woods, he proceeds to give the same task to several other dangerous criminals as well. After escaping from Tartarus, All for One orchestrates another large-scale attack, using both Nomu and the freed prisoners to attack 6 different prisons, all to distract the authorities and make it harder for them to track him. All for One is later seen sitting with Tomura and asks Spinner and Dabi to stand guard over him while his body recovers. Spinner asks who Tomura really was, stating All for One wasn't the person he chose to follow. All for One tells Spinner not to worry, saying he has the greatest respect for Tomura's will and that once his body recovers, both of their desires would come to fruition. Dark Hero Arc. After leaving Hibori Woods, All for One seeks refuge in a secret underground cave, one of the many safe houses he and Kyudai left behind as a contingency measure. He's greeted by not only a brand new life support mask to replace his original, but also a drug alongside a pre-recorded message from the doctor. It explains how Tomura got a hold of the Quirk-destroying drug created by the Shie Hasakai, which he immediately attempted to reproduce. After finding out it originated from someone's quirk, he decided rather than focusing on the quirk-destroying part, he focused on its original rewind effect during his recreation. He cautions All for One that he can only use it once, but that once he's freed, he's sure it'll help him achieve his dreams. He ends the message saying that his voice, eyes, and smile bring joy to his heart, and he wishes his heart be filled with hate. 1 month later, Lady Nagant tracks down Izuku and begins to capture him to execute All for One's orders. In the subsequent duel, Izuku defeats Lady Nagant and requests her to join his cause, only to suddenly have her explode. As it turns out, All for One had been monitoring the battle and, anticipating Lady Nagant's possible failure, had secretly transferred a self-destruct quirk, which he had detonated upon sensing her change of heart. He mocks Lady Nagant for being a woeful and pitiful woman, remarking that she was nothing but a tool to achieve ends from everyone, and she should blame her quirk for her tragedy. Expecting Lady Nagant to also reveal the location of their proposed meetup, All for One sets a trap in the former Creature Rejection Clan hideout, leaving behind a pre-recorded message for Izuku to find. In the message, he taunts Izuku for knowing that someone like him couldn't abandon someone like Lady Nagant, adding in that he didn't force her to join him and that it was her choice. He continues on about how those in society who fall are labeled as villains, and even if one takes pride in their quirk, if you can't fit into the controlled society, you'll be excluded, citing it as human nature. He concludes, stating the more Izuku fights, the more his soul will wear down, and reveals that while in prison, he was the one he never stopped thinking about, no longer having any interest in All Might, telling him it's his turn as the mansion explodes. Star and Stripe Arc. After abandoning the Hibori Woods mansion, All for One and the remnants of the League hide out in a secret cave alcove. While sitting in his own makeshift throne, surrounded by the remaining Nomu, All for One talks to Spinner about how thanks to the escaped inmates, the heroes and police have been too busy to put their full focus on them, allowing them to win their game of hide and seek. Spinner asks why they didn't just leave the country, but All for One says that evading everyone was just his first goal and that he has more planned. After Tomura's completion and acquiring One for All for One's next main goal is to get his hands on New Order, the quirk of Star and Stripe, the #1 hero of America. He believes that with that power, along with his own and One for All, he would finally have everything to make the entire world bend to his very whim. However, he is also aware that if Star and Stripe were to collaborate with Japanese heroes, especially One for All, then it would be trouble. So, using his connections to the criminal underworld all over the world, he got them to stir up enough trouble so that the nations would have to prioritize their own safety, delaying their arrival to Japan. However, he learns that Star and Stripe will be making her way over to the country soon. And while that would be trouble, he also reiterates that if he can get his hand on her quirk, nothing will be a problem anymore. He then turns to Spinner and tells him that after spending his time guarding him, he will be the one to support Tomura in his crusade, referring to him as the one who spins his tail, reminding him of his status as a heteromorph. All for One then proceeds to send out the still slightly incomplete Tomura out to battle and face down Star and Stripe. Meanwhile, within Tomura Shigaraki, the vestige of All for One continues to exert control, with the two starting to fuse together into one new being. As a result, Tomura now begins to recognize himself as Tomura and All for One, with the latter as the more dominant personality. Tomura goes after Star and Stripe and her army of fighter jets using a combination of radio waves, air cannon, and heavy payload, releasing an enormous wave of electric energy toward them. Star uses New Order, which can impose a new rule over whatever she touches and names, to remove the air from 100 meters in front of her, forcing Tomura to hold his breath, while All for One thinks about how it's a horrifying quirk that he really wants. The jets shoot lasers at Tomura from every angle, which he simply uses Reflect and Scatter to shoot back while his body regenerates. Tomura notices the air vacuum has come undone right after Star had used a new rule to catch the laser, wondering if that is the limit of New Order. He stretches his body and blasts his way forward toward her, but she simply jumps forward as well, punching him in the face. Star talks about when she was originally saved by All Might as a kid, and that he inspired her to be a hero, something that greatly irritates him as no matter where he goes, it's always about All Might. Now that she's touched him, Star uses New Order to declare that if Tomura Shigaraki were to move even an inch, his heart would stop. However, Tomura thinks about how she fell for his trap, all while All for One continues to push his dominance over Tomura, telling him how thanks to his hatred, the process that should have taken 2 months is now at 97 to 98% in just over 1. He gleefully tells Tomura to let his hatred flow, to deliver them to their glorious future, while the resistances permeate to the outside, with Tomura suddenly growing long hair and exploding. Regaining back some control, All for One, through Tomura, deduces exactly how New Order works. He was able to notice some of her limitations, like how while there's no limit to incapacitating someone, it can only power up a body to a certain amount. He also figures the rule can't arbitrarily involve things she hasn't touched. He realizes the true utility behind the quirk is that it has the most freedom of control with non-living things, as when it comes to naming a living thing, both targets have to have the same sense of understanding. The reason Star's declaration didn't work on him was because Tomura isn't sure of his true identity, whether he's Tomura Shigaraki, All for One, or even Tenko Shimura. However, for inanimate objects with no sense of self, Star's one-sided understanding is enough to enforce the rule. Thinking about all the potential tests for it just makes the quirk even more irresistible to All for One, and he wants it even more. After being jostled off the plane he was standing on, Tomura lands back on a flying Nomu when the two are suddenly blown far away by a giant air visage of Star and Stripe. They proceed to be pinned downwards into the ocean with a giant laser sword. Tomura realizes that something big is coming, and that Star is only using the laser sword to stall, so as the dangerous Tiamat missiles arrive to finally put an end to Tomura, he uses the Nomu to distract the pilots, while he uses Decay to dig underground, avoiding most of the brunt of the missiles and barely surviving. He emerges from the cracked hole, stating to them all that he was only just playing along with their game, and that if it was anyone other than him, they would have been done for. He proceeds to burst his way forward from jet to jet, gloating how me and myself will make better use of her resources. One of the pilots tells Star to try and end them quickly while he's on top of the jets, but Star is unable to do so, allowing Tomura to jump and grab her face. All for One within Tomura thinks about how he knew facing Star and Stripe with the incomplete body and without One for All was a gamble, but thankfully has finally paid off as he begins to steal New Order while simultaneously decaying Star. The hero uses the quirk to try and halt the decay, but only succeeds in delaying it due to reaching the cap of her strength. Successfully obtaining New Order, All for One calls Star an idiot for trying to protect herself and thinks back to Yoichi and when they used to read comics, now gaining the quirk being one step closer to his dream. However, before he can make use of it, the vestiges of Tomura and All for One are faced against a vestige of Star and Stripe, whose presence causes Tomura to internally explode in the real world. As it turns out, Star had used New Order in order to declare that the quirk would revolt against other quirks. A gigantic Star and Stripe begins to pound away at all the vestiges, including the ones of the stolen quirks, causing All for One to curse Star's name. All for One, as Tomura laments to himself that he can only steal or bestow quirks, not dispose of them, and desperately tries to find someone he can force New Order onto to stop the quirks from rebelling. Instead, the pilots continue to fire at Tomura with their laser barrage, while inside the Star vestige destroys the Reflect quirk. All for One once again angrily curses Star and Stripe as the Spectre of All Might. Tomura takes the Wing quirk from the remains of the Nomu and desperately escapes the battlefield, intending to find someone to pass on New Order to, once again cursing All Might's existence, taking off into the sky. He crashes in on the hideout of prison escapee Kashiko Kashi, touching his face, planning to take his quirk to make him quirkless so he can safely transfer New Order without it revolting, allowing him to preserve it. However, as he's about to, the Star and Stripe vestige mocks him, stating that thanks to all the quirks she revolted against, it has resulted in the destruction of the quirk itself. As she starts to fade away, she declares that even though she wasn't able to kill him, as long as people are willing to stand up to save each other, the will of heroism shall be passed on, and it will put an end to him. All for One angrily balks that the winner is the one who lives the longest, as the ghost finally vanishes. U.A. Traitor Arc. Tomura returns back to the League's secret base, screaming over in pain. All for One tells him to calm down since their quirk factors are damaged and need to heal. However, Tomura just keeps yelling obscenities, and that as long as people remember All Might, he'll never know peace. All for One notes that how since their minds have fused, he shares Tomura's hatred, telling him that even though they couldn't steal New Order, now that they've removed their greatest obstacle, they just need to take it easy for now. He tells the League to remain on standby for a bit longer, but Dabi responds against this idea, saying how he can't stand the sight of still seeing his dad flying around. All for One tells him that while they are very alike, they have one crucial difference. While Dabi may have only one goal firmly in his mind, he's planned out many different routes over the decades, all to eventually reach his final goal. He tells him that while they must wait for Tomura's body to be perfected again, now that Izuku has returned to the fortified UA, he mentions the other thing Dabi lacks: friends to spare. He promptly goes to contact the Ayamas once again, with the order for Yuga to isolate Izuku somewhere that they can get him. Dabi asks All for One whether it'll be a problem if his friends get caught, but he simply says it won't be at all. If his friends succeed, he'll be rejoiceful, but if they fail, it's just a brief disappointment before moving on to the next plan. His friends are merely just disposable tools that he wants to glean the most amount of excitement as they can. Sometime later, All for One sees Spinner checking in on Tomura's progress, which has turned him into a monstrous mutated body, before transforming back into Tomura himself. All for One tells Spinner not to worry, as his recovery is progressing smoothly, gradually overcoming the quirk singularity. Spinner asks if he's still Tomura, which he claims he is. All for One and Skeptic proceed to convince Spinner to take on the role of the commander of the Paranormal Liberation Front, to liberate the heteromorphic villains to their cause. Reluctantly taking on the role, All for One confidently states to him that everyone can be someone's hero. Final War Arc. In preparations for the upcoming battles in the Final War, All for One offered up additional quirks to the other members of the League. Dabi declined, but Spinner accepted. He determined that Kurogiri was being held at Central Hospital. Him not only being the high-end Nomu closest to perfection, and with his Warp Gate quirk being instrumental in their success, he tells Spinner to free him. He gives him 2 quirks, Body Bulk and Scale Mail, both of which will help give him the strength, defense, and appearance of a true leader, commanding an army of heteromorphs consisting of Paranormal Liberation Front members and civilians to storm the hospital. He also gives him a recording device containing his and Tomura's voices to wake him up, and in case that fails, implants a micro device in Nana Shimura's stuffed hand, which will reactivate him once again. For the next several days, All for One continues to watch over Class 1A using the Search quirk, seeing their fruitless efforts in attempting to track him down. Believing that the time is right, he prepares the next part of his plan and contacts the Ayamas. He thinks about how lies don't work on him thanks to a quirk he stole back during the first era of quirks, which has grown stronger due to his mix of other quirks. He recalls the original owner being a disappointment, however his descendant has become much more impressive, even working alongside All Might to bring him down. Either way, he figures the quirk will bring him victory. He calls up the Aoyama family, asking for a 40-year Macallan, which they respond will be aged 16 years and their son will deliver. He asks for their son's contact info, which they agree to. All for One senses no ill will, lies, or deception, meaning they're telling the truth through their coded conversation, and All Prepared is ready to meet up tomorrow. He then calls up Yuga, who also through no deception in his voice informs All for One of the meeting place where he will lure Izuku to. In an abandoned parking lot outside UA, All for One finally re-emerges in front of Izuku after Yuga deliberately lured him out into the opening successfully. He thanks Yuga for delivering Izuku as promised, asking how terrifying it was betraying his friend, and congratulating him on his big speech about his goals, having also promised his family a blessed existence in the new world. Unfortunately for him, Yuga overcomes his fear against him and turns against All for One, attacking him with his naval laser. All for One is caught off guard by the attack while Yuga hides in Izuku's smokescreen, with the two noting how he completely fell for their trap, and Yuga declaring for his mom, dad, and everyone's sake that he'll fight him. All for One is disappointed and confused, having not sensed any lies or ill intent in their conversations, unsure of how they deceived him. Annoyed, All for One states that even if it was a setup, he doesn't care because his prize is within reach. All for One is so close, and using Search, he knows that all the heroes Tomura fought in the war are miles away. So he uses his warping quirk to summon the Paranormal Liberation Front to overwhelm One for All and finally seize his prize. However, All For One is once again taken aback when he spots Kurogiri's warp gate starting to appear behind them, wondering what activated them. He thinks this saves him from the trouble of getting him back, only to spot Neito Monoma appearing from one of them. As the heroes begin emerging from the gates, Yuga declares to All For One the one thing he knows he fears most is that Japan isn't finished, and if they can lead the way, it will inspire the rest of them, so today is the day he falls. The final war has begun, and the heroes and villains rush to attack each other. All For One wonders if they plan on fighting in an all-out brawl, when All Might activates the Troy defense system as cages emerge from beneath the battlefield, capturing all the villains in individual metal containers. All For One knows they're aware they could just break through them easily until he realizes what their plan is. Just as they're all about to bust out after a few seconds, that gave the heroes just enough time for Neito to summon several more warp gates around the cages, allowing the heroes to shove them all in and separating the villains. All For One and some of the villain army are teleported to the ruins of the Gunga Mountain Villa, where Endeavor and a squad of heroes corner him. Hawks attempts to strike All For One straight in the head with his quirk, but failing to get through his mask. The heroes recognized All For One's warping quirk from the Camino incident to be inferior to Kurogiri's warp gate, taking it into account when they built the UA barrier, and that his hubris would now lead to his downfall. All For One mocks the heroes' plan to split them up, pointing out that dividing their forces due to the decline in heroes was necessary, while also noting the supposed ill-fated decision to pit One For All against Tomura, and worst of all, to have Shoto face off against Dabi, with All For One criticizing Endeavor for having his youngest son clean up his mess, and continuing his abuse toward the oldest. As the fighting continues, Endeavor and the heroes receive word that Dabi has been defeated by Shoto, causing him to react. In response, All For One comments on Endeavor's face, taunting him that he allowed his youngest son to take the burden of defeating his eldest sibling. Hawks tells Endeavor not to listen, expecting his upcoming verbal assault, while All For One continues, berating him for not even looking at Toya and letting Shoto handle everything, confidently stating this is why he'll never win, as he prepares to attack with his arsenal of quirks. All For One attacks Endeavor with crescent-shaped projectiles, which he manages to block with Hell's Curtain. Hawks shoots some of his feathers through the fire aimed at All For One's helmet. All For One deduces their strategy and realizes that the two heroes are coordinating their attacks to destroy his life support mask as he blocks the feather attack. Hawks attempts to attack from behind, but All For One once again blocks the attacks and taunts the number 2 hero, stating that even Recovery Girl couldn't save all his feathers and that he needs to use prosthetics in order to be at his top speed, but Hawks just laughs him off. Hawks flies away just as Endeavor comes in and attacks with Vanishing Fist. All For One notes that he can't block the attack with impact recoil and that Endeavor's heat is passing right through his hard flame fan shield. However, he also notices that Endeavor's attacks aren't quite on the same timing as Hawks's. He uses this opportunity to further taunt Endeavor for not being completely focused on their battle, and asks him if he's thinking about Shoto and Dabi. He then reveals that he's had his eye on Endeavor for decades, as Endeavor tried his hardest to surpass All Might. He then finishes his taunts by asking Endeavor about not finding Toya's body, revealing his role in his disappearance. This enrages Endeavor, who screams at All For One and attacks, only for the villain to take a massive slice at Endeavor's side with a massive quirk protrusion on his arm. Endeavor falls to the ground below as Hawks charges at All For One. He prepares to obliterate Nagant's replacement with a massive air cannon blast, only for Hawks to be saved by Heartbeat Wall, courtesy of the arriving Kyokajiro flying on top of Fumikage Tokayami. All For One disgustingly refers to the two students as gnats, referring to how in the comic he read as a kid, there were always side characters that only existed to be killed by the Demon King as a show of power. Kyoka confidently brushes him off, telling him to save the insults until he's actually defeated them. As the two student heroes in training join the battle against All For One, he notes that he needs to get back to his other self, and realizes that the heroes are trying to buy time for Endeavor to get back up and rejoin the fight. He turns his attention to Earphone Jack, deducing her as the weakest link in the group, and attacks her by shooting several heads at her. Hawks manages to use his feathers to save her, and then lands another strike on All For One's helmet with his sword. All For One notices and taunts Kyoka for showing fear, chastising her for seeing this fight as just another lesson from school, calling her a mere extra. He prepares a massive blast attack with his left arm and simultaneously holds back Hawks with rivets from his right arm. His attack lands on Kyoka, blasting one of her Earphone Jacks off. Despite the pain, she relents, decrying All For One's beliefs, and fights back with her Heartbeat Surround, Legato ultimate move. The attack barely phases All For One, who further taunts her for such an underwhelming attack. Suddenly, he's held back within the vestige world of his quirk as the vestiges of the quirks he has stolen over the years begin fighting back, restraining All For One and making him unable to use any. All For One comments on how even New Order wasn't able to achieve this, wondering how they were spurred on by such weaklings. This leaves him wide open for an attack as Hawks, aided by Kyoka's Soundwave attack, lands another blow on All For One, shattering a piece of his life support mask. As All For One is still stunned, and Fumikage uses Dark Shadow to use his ultimate move, Fleeting Blow, and lands another massive strike on All For One's shattered mask, successfully destroying it. As All For One ends up stunned by the attack, he notes that his awareness and reaction time is off due to the vestiges within his quirk rebelling against him. He realizes that since he gave up his original quirk to Tomura and is using a synthetic copy, his authority over his quirk has lessened. Within his vestige world, he begins to eat the other vestiges trying to rebel against him in order to reclaim control. Outside, Hawks prepares to land a killing blow, only for All For One to angrily unleash a massive burst of rivet stabs in all directions. Hawks is caught in the attack and severely injured, while All For One uses the opportunity to reassemble all the broken pieces of his life support mask in an attempt to put it all together. Suddenly, Endeavor re-enters the fight, fighting through all the rivets. Even as he loses an arm, with All For One taunting him for his doggedness, Endeavor persists, and creates a massive flame fist where his arm used to be, and smashes All For One, once again shattering his mask. All For One manages to barely protect himself from Endeavor's surrounding fire. He thinks about how he knew he might go hard on him, but never expected Endeavor would be the one to make him relive the pain he had when he originally faced All Might, reminding himself that a wounded hero is always the scariest. He's then caught off guard as Endeavor closes the distance, unleashing a vanishing jet burn attack, blasting him downwards onto the Gunga Mountain battlefield. Before he has time to fight back, Endeavor blasts himself downward, grabbing him and dragging him all throughout the forest. Due to his mask being destroyed and his body not listening to him, All For One tries to grab Endeavor and steal his quirk, but he proceeds to shoot fire from his eyes, burning his hand. Endeavor states that all his hands do is ruin people's futures, which All For One claims that he does too, but to which Endeavor simply agrees. Blasting his way into the air, despite All For One's attempts to stop it, Endeavor unleashes a prominence burn, engulfing All For One completely and reducing him to a crisped corpse. All For One is seemingly dead for good, but suddenly begins to speak, asking Endeavor if he believed he would show up to a big battle empty-handed. With his body having served its purpose and destined to be scrapped anyway, he had decided to test something out. As an eye and an ear begin to emerge from the villain's head, with a grinning smile on his face, All For One asks what made him think heroes were the only ones to make sacrificial moments, and that villains are also scariest when wounded. Meanwhile, Tomura, whose mind had almost completely been fused between Tomura and All For One, has been fighting off a group of heroes at the floating UA fortress, overwhelming them with his immense strength and growth courtesy of the quirk Singularity. However, upon his confrontation with Mirio Tagada, claiming he doesn't have any friends, the deep spirit of Tenko Shimura reawakens, causing Tomura to hysterically rebuke his claim. This action causes the All For One side of the personality to retake control, realizing that despite him supposedly being fully assimilated, he can sense that Tenko has not fully melded together yet. Knowing they can't let the action continue on any longer, Tomura heads over to try and finish off Katsuki in order to enrage Izuku once he finally arrives. The heroes continue to try and throw everything they can at the villain, but it proves fruitless to stop him. An incredibly injured Katsuki then steps up once again and utilizes his speed to dodge and evade each one of Tomura's attacks from up close. Tomura's actions begin to get more hectic, wondering how he is getting so pissed off and panicking by an extra who doesn't possess One For All, causing All For One to suddenly have a flash of memory to the second user of One For All. Despite the quick movements, Tomura is successfully able to land a hit right in Katsuki's chest, bursting his heart and seemingly killing him for good. While the heroes panic over Katsuki's lifeless body, Tomura laughs that they've come prepared with the perfect Demon Lord body for the final boss, and that this is their story, the villain's tale. Despite his domination, the heroes continue to put up a fight, with Edgeshot attempting to retrieve Katsuki from the inside. All of this makes Tomura increasingly more unstable, causing him to undergo another transformation, with his entire body comprised of fingers. This new increased strength is able to overwhelm the remaining active heroes, but Lemillion is able to distract Tomura for long enough for the electromagnetic barrier to be opened, allowing Izuku to join the battle, slingshotting into Tomura with a smash. Upon being sent backward, Tomura notices that Izuku is stronger now, with All For One recognizing the glow around him as being the quirk of the third user. Izuku then realizes the fate of all the other heroes, with Tomura ready to take advantage of his imminent emotional duress to counter him. However, Mirio steps in to calm Izuku down, and back under his own control, Izuku confronts All For One, asking if Tomura is still in there. Tomura simply responds that he no longer exists. Tomura and All For One have fully merged into a new being, and supposedly due to him being older, All For One is currently in charge, saying that despite whatever he's scheming, he won't get his ideal ending. But then, Lemillion tells Izuku about what happened earlier when he spoke harshly to him, which caused him to throw a fit as if he were a child, figuring he isn't fully merged. The more he was provoked, the more unstable he became, which starts to irritate Tomura. Seeing the disembodied faces of the Shimura family on his left arm, Izuku and Nana Shimura realize that Tomura is still in there, causing Tomura to retaliate. Jumping up into the air with all his power, shaking the entire fortress, Tomura charges at Izuku, angrily declaring he's taking back One for All. His smash erupts throughout the whole battlefield, but Izuku is able to stop the attack, telling All for One he's the one who won't get his ideal ending. He uses a combination of Black Whip and Fajin to create the Black Chain, wrapping it around Tomura's arm and sending him flying. Tomura attempts to try and wrestle the chain off, not intending to fall for the same move again, only to be surprised when Izuku undoes it himself. He then notices Izuku concentrating to himself when suddenly in the blink of an eye he appears under Tomura, punching him with such tremendous speed and sending him flying upward. Tomura is completely caught off guard by the attack, realizing its strength and speed is different from the glow he was using before, and that he's currently using a different quirk, the one of the second user, Gear Shift. Thanks to its ability to let the user shift and change the target's speed when touched, Izuku enables Gear Shift Overdrive, turning his 100% power into 120. U.S.J declares to his brother that today is the day they finally end things, as Izuku unleashes a fully powered Detroit Smash directly into Tomura's stomach. Seeing the power of Gear Shift causes All for One to recall back to his encounter with the second user of One for All, when his meta ability was only able to work on small objects, being nothing more than a pea shooter. He states that all he was meant to be was an insect in this path, becoming further enraged at how much the power has grown, just as he and Tomura are able to see the vestiges of One for All around Izuku. After crashing into the battlefield, Izuku comes at them with a Detroit Smash quintuple, knocking them further down. Tomura notes that the attack wasn't as strong due to him not having built up his glow, and despite being too fast to see, he figures he can predict the next attack based on the previous timing. However, he misses the swing as Izuku shifts into low gear at the last moment. Tomura attempts to counter again, but Izuku uses Danger Sense to detect the threat and immediately block his vision with Smokescreen. He then uses Float to quickly rise into the air, restraining and reeling Tomura up with Black Whip, preparing to combine the powers stored up thanks to the quintuple attack with Fajin, executing another blast of overdrive with Gear Shift, unleashing the full might of One for All. The second user states that their meta abilities were never what All for One should have been worried about, rather he should fear the reason why someone chooses to use their gifts. True power lies in an individual's intent, which is why people call them quirks. Izuku declares that he's giving it all he's got, telling All for One he won't let him hurt anyone else, and despite Tomura's screams in defiance, Izuku pounds him with his ultimate smash, breaking many of his fingers apart. As Tomura's body falls with a gaping hole in his chest, U.S.J states how One for All and All for One have begun to resonate with each other, able to see his brother within as the vestiges of Tenko, Tomura, and All for One attempt to recover from all the damage. He continues that what Lemillion said is correct, that the course of the battle and the events that led to this moment have shaken the balance of their melding. Meanwhile, Tomura laments over Izuku not holding anything back and using all his quirks, while he hasn't been able to use a single quirk yet, unable to show the true power of his body, all because of Eraserhead's erasure, the UA coffin, and all their underhanded tricks. Just then, his body starts to undergo another transformation as the massive hole in his chest begins to swell and expand. Back at the mountains, All for One is revealed to have used his trump card, that is, the reverse-engineered quirk-destroying drug, rewinding his body back to his prime state. He tells Endeavor and Hawks that while the heroes managed to keep the villains on the defensive during the previous war, it won't be the same now, since heroes are those who defend, villains are those who violate, and they will plunge headlong into their dream. He further compliments Endeavor, not thinking he'd have to play the card against him, and with how light his body feels, he swiftly makes his way down to the battlefield, stealing the quirks off of nearby heroes as well as their capes to cover his nudity. Hawks quickly pushes a hero away, while All for One reveals that he was using the drug's rewind effect. He's doomed to vanish, but since his dream has already been passed on to Tomura, he intends to rescue him from the hero's trap before he's gone. Hawks, attempting to stall for time, asks All for One what his dream is after obtaining One for All. All for One explains that he was influenced by comic books and asks Hawks why villains are feared over the world. Hawks responds that it's because they do bad things, but All for One states that in a world full of different cultures and values, those bad things would be an action that the masses react to in disgust. It's something that thwarts the future they envisioned. It is because of this that All for One wants to thwart the future of the world, as it's all he's ever wished for. He declares that if everything that has happened will spell out victory or defeat for all, then victory still lies within his grasp. To add further cause to his ideals, All for One declares that people's experiences when they're young define who they become, referring to Spinner's dark upbringing, so his feelings for the friends who accepted him are strong. He reveals his plan to have Spinner free Kurogiri, also mentioning that he installed a microchip in Nana Shimura's hand to make sure he was active no matter what state he was in. As two warp gates appear above the battlefield, he yells that Spinner has succeeded. Dabi gleefully emerges from one of them, saying hi to his dad, while from the other emerges Himiko, now transformed into twice, calling out to Hawks. All for One states that the sad man's deaths gave rise to the hatred in Himiko's heart, further aided by Dabi in his quest for revenge, giving her the tool she needed to destroy all. He tells Hawks to watch and see what will happen if he hadn't made his death his top priority before, causing Hawks to panic. Right before Hawks could attack Himiko, she unleashed Sad Man's parade all over the battlefield, swarming the heroes with thousands of doubles. With the heroes now in full retreat, All for One laughs as this is going on, thinking about how the chain of events is working in his favor, and figuring that Kurogiri warped himself to Tomura's location. He also thinks about how he should think about obtaining the Warp Gate Quirk for himself, as it is far superior to his sludge warping quirk. He attempts to use the chaos as cover and blast himself to Tomura himself, but Hawks blocks him, asking him why he's in such a rush to leave, even despite the rewind effect, realizing he doesn't have faith in Tomura's perfect body. Annoyed by Hawks' cleverness, All for One responds that he's right, the body isn't complete, and that he is still essential for the process. Hawks cries out to Endeavor that since their divide and conquer plan was a bust, if things fall apart now, it will eventually reach Deku and Tomura, so they need to stop Dabi now. All for One attempts to lambast Hawks by reminding him that Endeavor's body already lost an arm, and that he's supposed to be trying to stop him rather than abandoning his duty, but Hawks smugly responds that he's already lost to him once. Back at UA, thanks to Kurogiri and the twice doubles, Shota and Nato are attacked, undoing Erasure, causing Tomura to unleash a massive explosion, destroying most of the UA fortress. However, as a result of the massive damage done to the body, the All for One vestige loses control of it, still attempting to recover, while Tomura re-emerges from his skin within. As All for One struggles to retake control, Tomura attempts to attack, but both his arms are shot off by Lady Nagant, sniping from atop the hospital below. All for One, within Tomura, hysterically cries out to her, lambasting her for trying to play the victim after murdering her fellow heroes, only to be shut up by Tomura, who unleashes a horde of fingers out of his mouth. All for One realizes too late that his control over Tomura has started to wane as Tomura laughs, asking if his attempts at manipulation have failed and mocking his current state. He further criticizes his attempts at grooming him, using All Might and Nana Shimura to irritate him, scheming to hijack his body and soul, and attempt to absorb his hatred to steal one for all. However, as they merge together and become part of him, Tomura admits that he hated all of it, so he hid his own core deep within his own soul, and without him noticing, he's been reclaiming himself from the inside and out, both body and spirit, and desires to follow the path toward his origin. Infuriated, All for One tries to command Kurogiri to transport him to his other self at the Gunga Mountains, but Kurogiri begins to stutter, unable to comply. Tomura decided that he doesn't need One for All and that he won't let himself be controlled anymore. Breaking free of All for One's vestige, he states that his heart won't waver, and that everything that exists in the world led to the existence of the house he grew up in. Now back in complete control, Izuku knocks Tomura outside UA, where they prepare to fight to the death once again. With Tomura now free from his influence, All for One continues to try and escape Hawks' pursuit at Gunga. He explains how he was supposed to have full control of Tomura's body and that the fusion and new personality weren't part of the original plan. He stated how he underestimated Tomura's desire for destruction, which was stronger than anticipated, but nonetheless, all he has to do is get him to absorb his quirk factor and he will regain control of Tomura once again, allowing the creation of the Demon Lord to be complete. Hawks then retorts back that it isn't his story, but theirs, not his to do as he pleases, as he continues to swipe at him and prevent him from escaping. All for One mocks that the winds are blowing his way and seemingly kills Hawks by destroying his body with a spatial distortion quirk, but then suddenly Hawks' face turns all glittery and simply fades away, revealing him to be an illusion created by Kemi Utsushimi, who had arrived on time with reinforcements from the hero students of Shiketsu High School. Inasa Yoarashi proceeds to unleash a massive whirlwind which sucks up all the twice doubles, as he declares that he is the one who decides which way the wind blows. With the Shiketsu High School students joining as backup, the heroes throw their full assault into attacking All for One to prevent him from escaping. He touches one of the twice doubles only for it to melt, thinking to himself that he can only steal a quirk by touching the user's body directly, and while they only attacked him with 2 people at first to avoid that risk, they've now become desperate enough that they're willing to accept the risk. Despite the arrival of reinforcements, All for One still manages to overpower every one of them. Using several thorns extending from his back, he unleashes a massive laser explosion, decimating the battlefield below. The heroes, however, stand their ground to keep the defense strong and continue attacking, especially now that he stopped running away. All for One monologues, asking what makes them think they will emerge this time, that they've lost the only one who could face him head on, and how ignorant he believes they are, with none of them being born from his golden dark age, where his powers are at his peak, some of them only having witnessed All Might's rise to power, and that most being born when he reigned supreme. All for One tells him that he has lived in an era when people trembled in fear of something lurking in the darkness, when all were tainted by suspicion, resentment, exploitation, and prejudice, and how it was his golden dark age. Inasa proceeds to attack him with his whirlwind and berates him, retorting that they knew about that period through history class, and that he's decided to root for Endeavor and Shoto, believing hot-blooded passion will always triumph over fear. In response, All for One decides to try and steal some quirks, unleashing another hell of rivet stabs that manage to slice part of Inasa's face. Yet despite being injured, Inasa continues fighting and states that his quirk is even stronger on windy days, and that instead of All for One's ancient glory days, he'd rather see a future built by people he's cheering on. With the heroes throwing their attacks into the whirlwind cage, All for One becomes irritated at the look in their eyes, looking past him, and are constantly stoking the flames even after the light has gone out. He rebuked that it's all for naught since they won't come too close for fear he'll steal their quirks. Suddenly, he feels an ominous presence behind him and is stunned into silence as a massive dark shadow emerges. All for One then realizes what it was that made him tense up when he faced against this being earlier. Now completely immersed in total darkness thanks to the dark clouds blocking the sunlight, the flames dying out by the rainstorm, and covering him up in the earth to pile up the darkness, Fumikage tells All for One that even darkness comes in a range of shadows, and that they've already devoured the filthy darkness that he brought, as he reveals Dark Shadow's giant monstrous form as his total release of full power. Fumikage tells him what All Might said, how he can't steal Endeavor's quirk just by touching his flames, which is why he was tasked with supporting them, since he can't steal the quirk just by touching Dark Shadow. Fumikage proceeds to use Dark Shadow boosted by Inasa's whirlwind to unleash Black Abyss, Light of Balder, pulverizing All for One down into the ground. Fumikage continues his assault on All for One, but eventually he's able to retaliate by unleashing a massive nuclear explosion that blasts away Dark Shadow, greatly diminishing him once again. All for One states how obnoxious they all are, and as a result of the rewind effect, he has become visibly younger and more powerful. Now free, All for One uses his quirks to blast his way out of the battlefield. The heroes give chase, with Inasa carrying them with his wind, refusing to let him escape, when to everyone's surprise, Gigantomachia suddenly appears. All for One smiles, commanding him to finish them, but instead, the beast throws a giant mountainous boulder directly at his master. All for One is infuriated, cursing out the insects who are on Makia's back, Eijiro Kirishima and Hitoshi Shinso, who is currently brainwashing Makia. As he continues to be bombarded on all sides, All for One realizes that Hitoshi is the one who is controlling the behemoth. Deducing Hitoshi's quirk was how they were able to get the Aoyamas to deceive him, sarcastically commenting that it is his tactic. All for One proceeds to fire off a huge wave, blasting Gigantomachia and Hitoshi. Although Eijiro was successfully able to defend Hitoshi, All for One succeeded in seemingly breaking free of his control from Makia. However, even though Makia responds that he can recognize All for One's scent as his master despite looking different, he proceeds to ask why he was left behind. When All for One doesn't respond, Makia tearfully then yells that even after he came back in Tomura's body, despite having faith and waiting for him all the years since he went into hiding, he still abandoned him and ran away. Full of anger and rage, Makia turns against All for One and viciously attacks him, as he plus the heroes throw their full assault on All for One until he vanishes for good. Despite everyone's continued relentless assault, pushing his body to the absolute brink, All for One manages to find an opening to retaliate, sending a rivet stab to slice Mount Lady's stomach, causing her body to fall to the ground. He then turns to his former bodyguard, calling him a dog that must be put down as he uses his impure beam quirk to blast a lightning laser beam, destroying half of Gigantomachia's entire body and knocking him down. Due to his rapidly advancing rewind, his corpse continues to accelerate and regenerate at the instant, as All for One comments that, possibly due to the influence of his other self, there is something dark welling up inside him, that the younger he is, the more untamable it grows. Unleashing another powerful light blast of impure beam, he destroys Dark Shadow and eviscerates Hawks and Fumikage. He states that the more he gives into darkness, the more he can draw out his quirk's true potential. After destroying Dark Shadow, All for One proceeds his onslaught to massacre the heroes who attacked him, reminiscing on how much joy he was having being young. As the dust settles, all the heroes lie battered, broken, bleeding to death, or dead. With the majority of the heroes and Gigantomachia now incapacitated, All for One chokes the barely conscious Hawks by the throat, the latter stabbing him with his katana. All for One brushes off the sword and tells him to step aside because he's going to steal Fumikage's quirk as retribution for the trouble he caused. Despite his persistence, Hawks continues to fruitlessly resist, as All for One steals Fierce Wings for himself, noting that even with its quirk factor seriously damaged, he still managed to put up a good fight. Hawks comments on how his stockpiled quirks work outside his body and don't mesh well while he's rewinding, and that the damage is hastening the process, mocking him as a result. Just then, Minoru Mineta throws one of his pop-off balls at All for One's leg, weakly telling him not to steal Dark Shadow or else he'll become an edgelord, and that he should steal his quirk instead, begging him not to take it from Fumikage. All for One sees the look in his eyes, thinking about the howls of the weak, and decides not to waste another second and throws the powerless hawks away to leave the battlefield. Flying into the air, he tells the heroes that thanks to the press's arrival, people are going to see what happened, so they will know they failed again since they couldn't protect a single thing, blasting away to reach Tomura. All for One continues to speed past the ruins of Edo City, quickly approaching being in range with Tomura to use his warping quirk on him. However, he's surprised to see none other than his former nemesis, All Might, standing in the middle of the highway with his car and a briefcase. All Might asks aloud about their endless warring, further stating that they have realized Tomura's hatred has started to affect him and his main body, which means he won't be able to ignore him. With All for One closing in, All Might declares his signature motto, "I am here," unleashing an array of support items and weapons from his car and briefcase, and dons a mechanical suit of armor known as the Armored All Might. All for One can't help but look down upon him, grinning with madness in his eye as the two arch-enemies prepare to settle the score once and for all. All for One stares down at the suited-up All Might, thinking about him as his #1 hindrance in life, and yet his most fun toy to play with. He can easily tell he's just buying time as a distraction. However, seeing the still visible smile on All Might spurns All for One to angrily fight back, psychotically asking why he's still smiling and unleashing a destructive laser blast at him. All Might uses Hercules to activate Red Riot to shield his body in a protective coating ball, defending himself from the attack. While All for One's right arm is destroyed from the recoil, All Might blasts forward into the air. All for One recognizes All Might's classic style of a mad charge without dodging, yelling that it only worked because he had held One for All before. Just then, All Might activates several carbon wires that all snare directly into All for One's body, and he uses Black Whip and Charge Bolt to release electrical shockwaves that permeate through him, interfering with his regeneration. All Might yells out that ever since his final battle with his master, Nana Shimura, he's made a habit of starting fights with haphazard, long-ranged attacks in order to wear his opponents down before stealing their quirks. However, that approach only works on someone with a quirk. He then uses Cellophane to reel the wires into him, and Sugarman to build up his leg kick. All Might tells All for One he wanted to fight him one last time, and declares the suit and car are here to keep him in the fight, if only for a bit. He came up with the specs and put in the design request, stating how after he was defeated last time, he sought refuge in the States, where he made a friend, and these weapons are the fruits of that bond that makes him keep on fighting. He yells out that all he's been blessed with will bear its weight against him, and saying that he's never gone into a battle expecting to lose. With his suit powered up, All Might delivers a powerful kick into All for One's face with a shoot-style smash. With All for One staggering against him, All Might can't help but laugh about how wrong it feels being over 50 years old and beating up such a helpless lad. Seeing how much All for One is faltering, All Might gleefully shouts that any real demon lord would be aghast at getting beaten up by a quirkless man, keeping him in this obsession not to tear his eyes away from him. Enraged, All for One releases from the palm of his hand a quirk combination consisting of Springify, Brawn Boost, Air Cannon, Rivet Stab, Dark Ball, and Impure Beam, unleashing the dangerous rapid attack that crashes All Might back through several buildings. He manages to survive the assault using the utility cape auto guard Dark Shadow in the suit, as All for One flies over and reappears above All Might. He calls him a pathetic, washed-up piece of garbage, and how wearing his trash bag made him lose all perspective. Now he realizes the power of the suit. All he needs to do is destroy his gadgets before he can personally kill him, because unlike quirks, they can't go beyond their own limits. In response, All Might jokingly replies to All for One that the two of them ironically think alike, just before he flies up and delivers another punch. However, All for One doesn't flinch this time and angrily states he didn't fall for his cheap ploy to stall him since he can easily spare the time to clean up the trash, before he raises All Might with a powerful energy beam. Despite suffering from the major attack, All Might endures and simply continues to smile while calling it an undignified excuse, trying to play it cool. As All for One continues to blast All Might, a device ejects from his car nearby, which All Might uses to stab directly into All for One, unleashing the super acid injection Pinky. The acid starts to affect him, causing a violent reaction from his body. All Might shouts that he's dissolving away after rewinding some damage, laughing at him for calling him trash, and in response, All for One angrily yells at All Might. The battle ends up in Tatooine Station, as All Might is once again flung backwards through several buildings and crashing on a rooftop. Despite being closer to UA, All for One is now solemnly focused on chasing and hunting All Might. Despite sustaining serious damage and injuries, All Might does everything he can to stand as All for One once again appears above him. By this point, All for One has gotten noticeably younger again, needing to use multiple quirks to remove the acid from his body, but constantly taking damage is speeding up the rewinding process. Just then, All Might begins to maniacally laugh, louder and louder, further inciting All For One's rage as he bulks himself up to attack again, while he shouts for Hercules to send everything to him. With his arsenal equipping him, All Might activates the thrusters, Uravity, and Ingenium at full throttle, laughing and ready to win. As All For One continues to try and blast All Might, he uses the newly equipped weapons to evade him, the tentacle and floppy suction cups to swing in between the buildings, along the Shoto and Tailman weapons to act as defense. In a backstreet alleyway, All For One catches up to him and corners All Might, mocking him for laughing like a madman one moment and then running away the next, clearly aware of his goal so he has no problem in wasting excess strength, taking it easy being enough to kill him. He grabs the side of the buildings and unleashes an onslaught of rivet stabs right through the alley, which he barely evades. All Might blasts himself back up into the sky to get some distance, but All For One counters with 2 giant mouth quirks, halting his ascent. He blasts himself back downward, angrily calling him a liar, but All For One claims he is really just conserving power. As All Might avoids the attack, All For One mocks All Might about his missing smile, calling him a bag of bones missing half his guts, forced to rely on the suit giving him shoddy replications of the student's quirks. The rivet stabs proceed to rip the pieces apart one by one, reminding All Might that their fight is being recorded, meaning that the whole world is about to watch the symbol of peace falling to his death as the symbol of impotence. While All Might looks back, All For One suddenly ambushes him by breaking through a building in front, saying their guiding light is about to be snuffed out, and lands a devastating hit on All Might right in the stomach, crushing his spine. Despite the painful injury, All Might retaliates by using the tentacles to wrap up All For One and shoves a device into his mouth, laughing to him that lights flicker on and off, so while this light may be snuffed out, someone will be there to pick up his torch and shine on. All Might declares to let there be light in the darkness so that he may twinkle as well. Suddenly, a device appears right above them as All Might yells he's not there to lose and to know his name as he burns away. The Can't Stop Twinkling is then activated, powered by All Might's anima drones to send a giant laser bombardment directly onto him. All For One is pinned down by the powerful laser beam and attempts to break free from the blast zone, but All Might retaliates with Soundwave Vibration earphone jack to keep him contained. All For One fights back with a web of rivet stabs that slice apart more of the suit, so All Might unleashes the Morphing Armor Creati and Binding Rounds Grape Juice in an attempt to lock him in place. The Can't Stop Twinkling beam finally overheats and explodes. From out of the now exposed crater, a child-sized All For One emerges, reminding All Might tools cannot surpass their limits. All Might is stunned by this sudden appearance and charges toward him. All For One's back begins to expand, asking if he's forgetting to smile, but suddenly his body freezes in place. This was due to the arrival of Stain, using his Quirk blood curdle to swallow some of All For One's blood spilled on debris to keep him in place. With All For One's movement halted, Stain shouts for All Might to take him down. Stain charges downward on his glider with his katana to cut off All For One's head, while All Might flies forward with his fists ready to attack. However, right before they're about to land their attack, All For One uses forced quirk activation on himself and activates his bloodlet quirk, causing his blood to completely expel from his body. All For One angrily yells out to Stain, having kept the quirk in reserve since he anticipated that he would have to make a move because he never joined him and fled on his own after they escaped Tartarus. Stain tries to swallow the spilled blood anyway. However, All For One reveals his antigen swap quirk, able to overwrite his own blood type, which is how he's been able to never leave a trace of himself. A fist extends from All For One's back to grab Stain and crushes his body. All Might rushes towards Stain, only for All For One to thrust the fist, tossing him through several buildings in the distance. All For One immediately blasts into the air and appears before Stain's barely conscious body, declaring he'll be taking his quirk now. He comments on how he made valuable contributions to the growth of Tomura and the League of Villains, but that is where his role ended. All Might desperately chases after them, calling out to All For One, while Stain weakly coughs out that it didn't end and was all part of the process. He stretches his arms out as a final sign for All Might to live on in triumph just before All For One smashes right into Stain, killing him and taking his quirk. With Stain dead, All For One turns his attention back to All Might and prepares to fire a deadly blast from his palm. Just as All Might is about to be hit by a point-blank attack, the last remains of Hercules appears to give him one final shield as the shockwave crashes him through many buildings. All Might manages to survive this blast, but the attack took a toll on him, with the suit completely destroyed and his legs and arm broken. However, despite being severely wounded, All Might remains determined, prepared for All For One to come to do his worst. While All For One looks toward the crawling All Might, he notices the floating UA falling in the distance, meaning he has reached in range to Tomura's location. All For One takes All Might to UA so he can show the world his failure. Now that he's within range, All For One states that ever since injecting himself with the rewind drug, getting to that location has been his goal, so that he can give his quirk copy to Tomura so that he can become a stronger version of himself. All Might attempts to get him to focus on him, but All For One ignores him and activates his warping quirk on Tomura, so as not to deal with Izuku and One For All's interference. However, instead, Tomura rejects this, swallowing the gloop and telling his master not to interfere. All for One realizes that Tomura's consciousness has overcome his own, and looking down at All Might, he smiles, saying that he'll have to do the legwork himself. All for One carries the battered All Might by the leg, telling him to show everyone how pathetic he looks and to take responsibility for the false dreams he filled their heads with. As he vastly approaches the fighting Izuku and Tomura, All Might suddenly ushers all the strength he has and grabs a hold of All for One tightly, shocking him. Just then, he unexpectedly flashes back to Nanoshimura's final moments before death, when she sacrificed herself to save All Might's life. He's confused as to why he's remembering this until he recalls her last words when she said All Might will be the one to defeat him, because he is even more unhinged than himself. He realizes what he's about to do as All Might confidently asks if he will turn into a kindergartner again after this death, as All Might unveils his last remaining gauntlet device, prepared to blow up the both of them. Right before the device activates, All for One snarks at All Might's attempt to choose how he'd like to leave this world all hero-like, and refuses to let him die like that, so he uses his spear-like bones from his arm to destroy the gauntlet. Now that he's finally used up all his tricks, All for One swaps some of All Might's blood and uses Blood Curdle, paralyzing him. All for One grins excitedly as he sees the face he's been wanting all this time, All Might in absolute despair at his lowest. Gentle attempts to help All Might, but All for One unleashes a powerful laser blast at UA, forcing Gentle to keep his hold on it. All for One comments that UA distracted him and threw off his aim, and tells Gentle to be crushed under his own righteousness. The American military arrives to fire their lasers at All for One, but he recognizes them as the X-66 jet fighters that helped Star and Stripe fight Tomura, and effortlessly takes them down with a single blast before they can fire, stating that Star is no longer with them. With All Might immobile and defenseless, All for One carries his body above him and prepares to rip it apart in front of everyone watching the broadcast. As he gleefully laughs while everyone reacts in fear and anxiousness with seemingly no one left to save him, Katsuki suddenly emerges from the smoke atop UA, having survived his near death from Tomura. Within those brief few moments, Katsuki blasts himself downward towards Izuku, who uses gear shift on Katsuki and in conjunction with his cluster technique is sent through the skies at insanely blistering speeds. Despite the odds, Katsuki travels at such speeds, he succeeds in stealing All Might back from All for One's hands, ripping them apart in the process. All for One is left speechless and annoyed at the display, while Katsuki yells out that they're going to win. After Katsuki and All Might land on a nearby building to recover, All for One is infuriated at being once again undermined, but before he can go back after them to retaliate, stops himself, realizing he's almost out of time. He refocuses his efforts on obtaining One for All and his brother by hijacking Tomura's will with his Quirk and himself. With his blood boiling, he laments his Vestige's failure as the faces of all the heroes who he fought against flash through his mind, wondering how the gears have gone so awry, and that the wind was meant to blow his way. Suddenly, Katsuki attacks All for One by grabbing his face, shouting that he's the final boss. In that moment, All for One has another haunting flashback of the second user of One for All, allowing Katsuki to unleash a devastating explosion at point-blank range, declaring that if One for All couldn't keep him in the ground, they'll finish the job. All for One recovers from the attack, still incredibly annoyed, but remarks that he'll deal with him later and simply blasts forward past Katsuki towards Tomura. All for One thinks about how Katsuki's not as strong as Endeavor or Dark Shadow, and especially not All Might, so he can wait, refusing to let him speed up the rewinding process for being a mere pebble in his path. Unfortunately for All for One, he was taken back when Katsuki somehow manages to catch up with him at incredibly insane speeds, wondering who he even is. All for One wonders why this pebble is making him angrier than All Might when he once again sees a flash of the second user of One for All, realizing how much they share a resemblance. All for One recalls the time where he choked the second user out before he revealed that Yoichi is gone because he killed him. All for One surmises his feeling of hatred brings back those memories, and that it all comes back to him, as if he never reached his hand out to Yoichi, none of this would have happened. Katsuki fires back with another powerful explosion, blasting All for One back into another building, and All for One realizes who he truly hates the most is. Blinded by rage, All for One yells out to Kudo that he's to blame for everything. In response, Katsuki remarks if he's gone senile, calling himself Kachan Bakugo. Attempting to recover from the attack and emotional whiplash, All for One wonders how it could be possible since he completely ended Kudo's bloodline, eliminating every woman and child he'd been close to. He also thinks to himself that if he was his descendant, he would have been able to sense it when they first encountered each other in Kamino. It's then that he realized it's all in the eyes, and that they share a similar look of determination, and is convinced that now a willful resolve resembling Kudo's has crossed time and space to finish what he started. The villain tries to think about warping Katsuki away, but knows it won't work since the only available warp points are All Might and Tomura, who are both nearby, and he also can't afford to drag out the battle any longer before he shrinks away, especially since the conflict with Tomura is inevitable now that he's already rejected him once. Running out of time, All For One decides that he will kill Katsuki, reach his goal, and execute the transfer of his quirk all in one move. All For One proceeds to transform his body and executes his ultimate gambit, Omnifactor Unleash, All For One goal, releasing every single quirk and quirk factor within his body, preparing to propel himself forward and decimate everything in his path. All For One releases his attack, blasting forwards at lightning-fast speeds and leaving a path of destruction in its wake. As he rushes toward Katsuki, who keeps firm without moving, suddenly his mouth explodes apart, leaving him disoriented and confused since Katsuki didn't appear to do anything. Katsuki reveals that due to his explosions being weaker in the rain, he coated the explosive sweat beads with regular sweat without triggering them, shielding them from the intense rainfall and hoping that something else would set them off. All For One realizes he somehow shot them into his mouth when he got up close to him earlier. Katsuki admits that he's always received kudos from others for his intuition, and declares he only needs his one quirk to stop him. The erratic All For One, with his power in disarray from the cumulative damages he's taken, angrily shouts out that it's his tail, and yelling for the extra to get out of his way. In response, Katsuki unleashes his super-empowered howitzer impact and attacks All For One head-on. His attack destroys All For One's monstrous appearance and a violent torrent of explosions all over as Katsuki yells for All For One to shut up. All For One notices he's been suddenly unable to mix his quirk factors together, and that it's not the explosions doing, wondering if it's because he's become too young and delicate to keep control of his quirk factors. However, within his vestige realm, Hawks appears inside, surrounded by the other vestiges of the quirk factors he's stolen, telling him that all his negative emotions have got him acting up, so he's losing control of them, snarking that he's been swallowed up by Tomura. Unable to counterattack, Katsuki declares that this is our tail, and destroys All For One's face with a ginormous explosion at point-blank range, sending him careening toward the ground. Despite surviving the attack, now merely just an infant, All For One slowly crawls his way out of the crater and across the debris, still persistent in his desire to transfer his quirk into Tomura so he can take over his body. He thinks about how his vestige self must have been taken out before he could employ a certain last-ditch tactic, so victory is still in reach. As he slowly continues forward, he thinks about Yoichi and states to himself that the negatives in life tend to stick in one's memory longer, which is why he wants to thwart the futures of others, so that everyone's eyes are on him forever. Just then, Katsuki stands before him, startling him, but due to overexhausting himself, he's on the verge of passing out from injuries. All For One, who now can't even speak, mumbles to keep going, only to be horrified as Katsuki stands his ground and with a vicious grin, angrily declaring he must achieve an absolute victory. All For One panics and shoots a spear-like bone from his mouth at Katsuki, but he simply catches it in his mouth and blows it up. Realizing that he let his emotions get the better of him and it's now too late, All For One lets his rage consume him as he cries and whines, shouting no and hate to himself as his body reverts back to that of a fetus. As the quirk factors within him all start disappearing, he further rewinds into that of an egg cell and finally disappears for good. Meanwhile, Izuku confronts Tomura's desire for destruction within the vestige world and defeats him in a battle of willpower. However, Tomura's will begins to waver, which causes a monstrous form of All For One's vestige to re-emerge and swallow up Tomura. He laughs at his foolish vessel for losing in a battle of wills to an absolute nobody, mocking him for striving for strength while being invariably weak, stating that not once in his life has he ever made his own choice. All For One berates Izuku for destroying One For All and Yoichi, but notes that thanks to Tenko's spiritual defeat in the subconscious realm at Izuku's hands, he's once again able to regain control. He then speaks to the slowly disintegrating Tomura, calling him no more than a superego unable to relinquish his own life, taking his guidance all the way and yet amounting to nothing. Tomura was confused and doesn't understand what he's talking about, as All For One reiterates that none of his decisions have ever been his own. Tomura claims that he chose to do all of them, but All For One responds that him believing so was key, or else his strength of will would be stunted, thus it was crucial to twist his illusion of free will and reveals to him everything in the past. He proceeds to reveal to Tomura all of his orchestrations of his life, all for the purpose of cultivating a being of hatred that could override One For All's willpower and claim it. He reveals how he convinced Kotaro to have another child, how he stole his original quirk factor as an infant, observed him as he grew up, and eventually bestowed upon him decay. Tomura breaks down in agony as the revelations rush towards him, with All For One declaring that all his tragedies, ordeals, rejection, and validation were all granted by him and for him. Tomura's mind shatters as memories of those he fought in the past flash through his mind, while All For One continues to shout at him, shaming his unwavering heart, and to be gone from his body. He thinks about how his spirit is now his to delete, intending to have used it as a last resort after stealing One For All, but decides now is the time since it's no longer in the cards. Emerging back in the real world, All For One, now in control of Tomura's body again, laments that Yoichi is gone, so his intermediate plan is foiled. He can still hear the screaming voice of Tomura's lingering memory in his head, so he forms a version of one of Tomura's stuffed hands over his mouth to silence it. All for One examines the body, noting the spiritual damage has taken its toll, that Tomura's anger and hatred are gone along with decay. With the vessel he searched for and cultivated over years now ruined, and his little brother gone, he declares that there is nothing left but to move on to his hollow final goal of world domination. He calls out to Izuku, wondering if he's dead, with Izuku managing to survive and calling out to him, declaring that he won't let him. Just before he could get up, Izuku suddenly falls forward onto himself, realizing to his shock that both of his arms are completely destroyed. All for One comments that neither of them emerged unscathed, as Izuku screamed in agonized pain trying to move. All for One states that loss endangers strength, which is a narrative he intends to establish, calling it a pitiful end for a child with nothing to lose in the first place. He's about to attack when suddenly Hantasero appears, using his tape to hold All for One back. All for One proceeds to think about how his presence was negligible enough that Izuku's presence obscured his warning. Hanta declares they're here to save him when Rikido Sato and Mashirao Ojiro also arrive, blasting the villain back with their Tornado Tail Dance and Sugar Knuckle ultimate moves, while Eraserhead also arrives to the battlefield through a warp gate. All for One is surprised as many more warp gates begin to appear all over the battlefield, asking if they've come to have their quirks stolen as an army of heroes arrive to provide reinforcements. After the heroes declare "we are here," All for One stares at the array of dull ashen flesh among Izuku, thinking that as a part of Tomura he was supposed to shatter alongside him, but when he heard Yoichi's vestige breaking, all the color faded from his world. He tells them that with his obsession gone, only a gaping hole of loss remained, one which no attack could strike, which allowed him to evade his death below. Unleashing a horde of dangerous quirks from his arms and legs, he tells Izuku that he now understands that tragedies engender true strength, asking if he agrees. However, Hantasero interjects, saying that unlike many others, his life has not been filled with wild highs or tragic lows, and all he had pushing himself forward was not wanting to fall behind his classmates, and he believes everyone would be better off not having to go through all that miserable and tragic crap. As he charges toward the villain, just then 2 warp gates surround All for One, revealing Shoto and Endeavor, who blast him with a dual Flash Fire Fist combo attack. The heroes join in and begin to charge toward All for One as the villain prepares to attack them, lamenting the Legion of the Wounded, desperate heroes, making him feel nothing but forlorn, considering them all as afterthoughts compared to All Might. Before he can attack, 13 starts to pull him in with her black hole, and is then countered by Gang Orca's Orcanus and Seji's Meatballs. He tries to retaliate, but Burnin and several other heroes use their quirks to divert most of the blasts. Despite being heavily outnumbered, he's too fast for everyone, and they need at least a dozen heroes just to deal with one attack. All for One unleashed a horde of attacks, blasting away every hero who tried to stop him, but they kept on countering his attacks, protecting Izuku as he comes rushing in forward. All for One declares that his Omnifactor Unleash is not the result of him giving into his emotion, but rather it's him exercising control and authority over his powers, telling the heroes not to presume that they have him outnumbered. He forms a large laser and blasts it straight toward Izuku, but Toru Hagakure confidently jumps in front of it to refract it at the cost of permanently damaging her quirk. Momoya Yorozu and Denki Kaminari then produce the electromagnetic railgun, which they activate and fire directly into All for One, piercing through the tendrils of quirks, but he blocks it with one arm, annoyingly calling them insolent and countering. Izuku shouts for him to leave them alone when several UA Hero Corps students jump in the way to take hits and block several attacks. All for One retaliates by sending a large rivet stab structure to crush Deku, but Rijiro, Mina Ashido, and Fat Gum rush in to block it, allowing Izuku to continue forward. Frustrated, All for One wonders why all the carcasses refuse to just die, how there's little life in their weary movements, yet their eyes still show persistence. He then recalls back to when he mocked Izuku in the Vestige world, saying how he always finds himself helplessly watching, and that giving the power to him was a mistake. This is when he finally realizes that it is because of Izuku, and that it is his weakness, something All Might lacked. A weak, feeble strength that spurs everyone on to stand up so doggedly, and it will not perish for as long as it continues to move forward. All for One holds his hand out only to realize that his body is starting to crack. He couldn't react in time as Izuku manages to reach All for One, and with the last embers of One for All, he bashes a smash right through his chest. All for One reacts hard to Izuku's point-blank attack, wondering why he didn't realize that super regeneration wasn't working on the body and that something should have felt off. Eventually, he figured out that they all conspired. Each individual only represents a feeble threat, but as a united force, they somehow dulled his danger sense without him realizing. He further realizes that when Izuku drove Yoichi and the other users into the core, it wasn't only his spirit that was destroyed, but the body as well. As a result of all the damage inflicted on him, Tomura's body begins to shatter along with the quirks he used to attack the heroes. But before he vanishes, All For One uses his quirks to forcefully hold his body together, declaring he hasn't achieved anything yet and that no one can rob him of what's his, angrily stating that only his dream gets to come true and that nobody gets to pick up the torch. The Demon Lord is singular and absolute. He thinks about how he needs to just repeat the process like he did with Tomura, to just transfer All For One to Izuku or anyone to let him claim their body. All For One shouts for a new vessel and Izuku shouts that he's done and charges another punch. Suddenly, Kurogiri starts to move once again, warping himself right in between the hero and villain. Kurogiri asks All For One to give back Tomura and that his friends await him. Suddenly, Katsuki appears and shoots an explosion out of his mouth right at Kurogiri, killing him. Just before Izuku is about to attack, he tells All For One that he can't look past what he's done, but knows he's not some monster beyond all understanding, that he isn't a demon lord, but just a lonely man. All For One shouts for him to stop and not look at him, as Izuku unleashes one final punch into his arm. In the Vestige realm, All For One sees the remaining embers of Yoichi. He tells him that Izuku managed to adjust the violent transfer in just a way that the barest fragment would remain intact, which was able to resonate with the embers still within him, all to do right by his last shreds, so he could complete One For All as it was meant to be. All For One maniacally says it doesn't matter because he wants him to not fade away and to show his face, but Yoichi says it's impossible since his time is up. All For One's face returns as he further panics, begging Yoichi that he's his and to let him see his eyes. Yoichi laments that he couldn't guide him down the right path, and that what Izuku conceived for them here was their final salvation at the end of it all. All For One shouts that he won't allow it, telling Yoichi that he loves him and that he will be hopeless and nothing without him, but Yoichi simply says it's time for him to pay the price for all his crimes. Yoichi reveals that Izuku has awakened more than just him, as Tomura and the One For All users emerge from the void. Before All For One could react, they all land one last hit on All For One to destroy him for good, ending his reign of terror once and for all. Did you enjoy our video? Be sure to check out these other great videos from the Amagi and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.